He didn't whisper it, didn't pull her aside, didn't offer even the basic dignity of a private conversation. Victor Blackwell stood at the head of that long mahogany table, looked at Evelyn Carter like she was a piece of furniture he'd grown tired of, and said the words loud enough for every single person in that boardroom to hear. "You're done. Clean out your office. Security will escort you out." The laughter started before she even reached the door. 15 years, gone in 40 seconds. If you've ever worked somewhere and given everything you had, only to be thrown away like you never mattered, this story is for you. Stay with us until the very end. Hit that like button and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. The morning of March 14th was the kind of morning that made Chicago look like it belonged on a postcard. The sky was that particular shade of pale blue that only showed up in early spring, thin and bright, the kind of light that made the glass towers downtown look almost warm. Evelyn Carter drove to work the same way she had for 15 years. The 7:12 a.m. exit off the Dan Ryan, past the coffee cart she sometimes stopped at when she had 4 minutes to spare, into the underground parking structure of Blackwell Capital Group's headquarters on South Wacker Drive. She parked in her usual spot, Level 2, Space 47. She'd never asked for a better spot. The executive spaces on Level 1 had always been Victor's idea of hierarchy, and Evelyn had long ago decided that particular battle wasn't worth fighting. She took the elevator up to the 31st floor with her travel mug in one hand and a folder of end-of-quarter operational summaries in the other. She had a 9 a.m. meeting with the risk compliance team, a call at 10:30 with their logistics partners in Atlanta, and she needed to finish reviewing the merger integration timeline before the all-hands at 2. The Meridian Technologies merger was 3 weeks out, 14 months of work. She had built the operational roadmap from scratch, cross-referenced it against 3 different risk models, and personally signed off on every integration checkpoint. It was not going to be a light day. She was halfway through her first cup of coffee when her assistant, Daniel, appeared in her doorway looking like he wasn't sure whether to come in or run. "Dan," she said, not looking up from the folder. "You have a face." "I always have a face?" he said. "You have a different face. What happened?" He hesitated. Victor moved the board meeting up. It's in 20 minutes. He sent the calendar update at 7. She looked up then. He moved the full executive board meeting, 20 minutes from now. Yes. Without telling me last night. Without telling anyone last night. Daniel shifted his weight. "I only know because Simone from the board secretary's office texted me. Apparently the agenda's different too." Evelyn set down her coffee. "Different how?" He didn't answer right away, and that told her everything she needed to know about how different it was. "Okay," she said. She closed the folder. "Thank you, Dan." She spent the next 17 minutes finishing her coffee and checking, one more time, the system access protocols she had quietly spent the previous 6 weeks adjusting. Not obviously. Not in ways that would flag an audit, but she had known, somewhere in the back of her mind, that a day like this was coming. She had known it since December, when Victor's attorney had started appearing at office's meetings that didn't require an attorney. Since January, when Lauren Pierce, Victor's chief strategist and closest ally, had begun CCing herself on emails she had no operational reason to be on. Since February, when Evelyn had found a discrepancy in the transfer logs that she couldn't explain with any legitimate accounting framework. She had taken that discrepancy home and studied it for 2 weekends in a row. Then she had made some calls. The board meeting was in the 42nd floor conference room, floor-to-ceiling windows, leather chairs around a table that cost more than most people's cars. When Evelyn walked in at 8:57, 7 of the 9 board members were already seated. Victor stood at the far end of the table, coffee in hand, talking to Lauren Pierce in a low voice. He glanced over when Evelyn entered. He didn't greet her. She found her seat, second from the left, where she always sat, and set her folder down and waited. The last 2 board members arrived and settled in. Victor didn't call the meeting to order so much as he just started talking in that particular way of his that made very clear whose room this was. "Good morning," he said. "I'll keep this short. We're 3 weeks from the close of the Meridian acquisition. This is the most significant moment in Blackwell Capital's history, and I want to make sure we cross the finish line with the right people in the right seats." He paused. He looked around the table. His gaze moved past Evelyn without stopping. "I've decided to make a structural change to our executive leadership. Effective immediately, the Chief Operations Officer position will be eliminated." The room went still. Not completely still. Somebody's chair shifted, somebody clicked a pen off. But there was a sudden quality to the air that was different from 2 seconds earlier. Evelyn didn't move. Evelyn, Victor said, looking at her now, has served this company for 15 years, and we thank her for that. The way he said it was the way you thanked a waiter for bringing water. Cursory. Automatic. Already done. But as we transition into this next phase of growth, we need streamlined decision-making and an operations structure that reflects where we're going, not where we've been. Board member Thomas Raines, 60, silver-haired, always on Victor's side of the room in any argument, cleared his throat. What's the timeline on the transition? Immediate, Victor said. The operations portfolio transfers to Lauren's division today. Evelyn looked at Lauren. Lauren was looking at her planner, not at Evelyn. I have a few questions about the integration timeline, and board member Shirley Nguyen started. Shirley, Victor cut in, and his voice was smooth but firm. We've handled this carefully. The transition is managed. I wouldn't move on this 3 weeks from close if I weren't completely confident. He turned back to Evelyn. And this was when it happened. This was the moment she would think about later. Not with anger exactly, but with the particular clarity that came from watching someone make a catastrophic mistake in slow motion. You're done, Victor Blackwell said. Clean out your office. Security will escort you out. The silence lasted about 4 seconds. Then David Cho, the youngest board member, 38 years old, who had always laughed too quickly at Victor's jokes, did laugh. Just once, a short, involuntary sound. But it broke something, and Gary Wells followed with a low chuckle, and Thomas Raines said something under his breath to the man beside him, and within 10 seconds there was laughter in the room. Not uproarious, not cruel in an obvious way. The polite, complicit laughter of people who had decided whose side they were on and were signaling it in the only safe way available. Evelyn Carter sat with that laughter around her for exactly 3 seconds. Then she stood up, picked up her folder, and walked out. She did not look back. She did not cry. She did not slam the door. She walked to her office, which was down the hall, and 2 turns to the left, and she stood inside it for a moment looking at it. The framed organizational chart she'd redesigned 4 years ago. The shelf of operational manuals she'd written herself. The photo of her and Dan at the company's 10th anniversary event, both of them laughing at something she couldn't even remember now. 15 years of choosing this building over sleep, over weekends, over any number of things she had decided could wait. She took the photo of Dan. She took a small blue ceramic mug her niece had painted for her. She took nothing else. The security guard's name was Philip. He'd been working the building for 6 years. He didn't make eye contact when he met her at her office door, and she didn't make it easy for him by pretending the situation was normal. "Hi, Philip," she said. "Miss Carter?" He was staring at the wall just past her shoulder. "I'll be quick," she said. "Take your time," he said, and she could tell he meant it. She was in the elevator 4 minutes later. She rode it down to level 2. She got in her car. She sat there for a moment with her hands on the steering wheel, the ceramic mug on the passenger seat, the folder open to the merger integration timeline she'd never get to finish. Then she picked up her phone and made a call. "It happened," she said when the line connected. A man's voice, steady, professional. "Are you out of the building?" "Parking garage." "Drive to the coffee shop on Randolph. I'll have someone there in 30 minutes. She put the car in reverse. She backed out of space 47 for the last time. She drove to the coffee shop on Randolph. Special Agent Marcus Webb of the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit had a face like someone had been trying to sand it down for years without quite finishing the job. He was 51, heavy-set, with reading glasses he kept losing and finding in his own jacket pockets. He sat across from Evelyn Carter in the corner booth of a coffee shop 6 blocks from the Blackwell Capitol building and watched her set a portable hard drive on the table between them. "I want to be very clear about something," Evelyn said. "I'm not doing this because I'm angry." Webb looked at the drive. "Okay. I'm doing this because in 3 weeks, a publicly traded company with 2,200 employees and 460 institutional investors is going to finalize a merger that will be built on a fraudulent balance sheet. And then a lot of people who had nothing to do with any of this are going to be in serious trouble." He looked up at her. "How long have you been building this?" "Seriously? 4 months. But I noticed the first irregularity 14 months ago." She paused. I thought I was wrong. I went back and looked twice. Then I found the second one and the third one, and I stopped thinking I was wrong. The drive, he said. What's on it? Transaction logs from our internal accounting system going back 4 years. Communications between Victor and his external financial manager, a man named Gregor Holt, who has offices in the Cayman Islands and Zurich. Wire transfer records. Audit files that were altered. I have both the original versions and the altered versions. And 3 audio recordings. Webb didn't reach for the drive yet. You recorded him? In states where single-party consent is legal, she said. I knew what I was doing. I'm not naive. What are on the recordings? She folded her hands on the table. One is a conversation between Victor and Lauren Pierce in which they discuss how to reclassify assets before the Meridian audit. One is Victor instructing Gregor Holt to move funds in a way that would not survive scrutiny from any forensic accountant. And one is a conversation in which Victor says, explicitly, that if the audit finds the pension fund exposure, they'll blame the operations department. The coffee shop was not loud, but the sounds around them continued. Espresso machine, soft music, 2 women at the next table talking about somebody's birthday party. Evelyn sat inside those sounds and watched Marcus Webb reach across the table and pick up the hard drive. You've been sitting on this, he said. I've been verifying it, she said. There's a difference. I wasn't going to hand over something I wasn't certain about. He turned the drive over in his hands. You understand that once I take this, there's a process. It won't be quick. I know how federal investigations work, she said, but I'd encourage your team to look at the Meridian timeline. If this closes, unwinding it becomes significantly more complicated. He nodded slowly. He put the drive in his jacket pocket. I'll need you available, potentially for several weeks. I'm available, she said. I don't have anywhere to be. He almost smiled. Almost. Miss Carter, can I ask you something off the record? Sure. He fired you in front of the whole board. He did. And you just walked out. She looked at her coffee. I spent 15 years building something, and then I spent 4 months making sure he couldn't take it with him when it fell. So yes, I walked out. She looked up. There wasn't anything else I needed to do in that room. Webb sat back. Okay, he said. Okay. At 9:47 a.m., 12 minutes after Evelyn Carter drove out of the Blackwell Capital parking garage, the first transaction failure was logged. It appeared in the internal system as a routine flag, a timeout error on an outgoing wire transfer to one of their portfolio companies. The kind of thing that happened a few times a year. The kind of thing that got forwarded to IT and resolved in 20 minutes. Except that when IT attempted to resolve it, they discovered the authentication credentials for the wire transfer authorization system had expired. Not crashed. Expired. As in, the credentials had a renewal date built into the underlying protocol, and that renewal date had passed. The protocol required the Chief Operations Officer's digital signature to renew them. The Chief Operations Officer had just been fired. Travis in IT escalated to his manager. His manager escalated to the head of technology infrastructure, a man named Ron Braddock, who had been with the company 8 years and who had the rare quality, in tech, of actually understanding the systems he managed. Ron looked at the error. He looked at it again. He pulled up the architecture documentation for the wire transfer system and found, on page 34 of a document that had last been read by anyone in 2021, the note that the authorization framework required a 2-factor renewal every 18 months, and that the renewal had to be initiated by the COO and confirmed by an external security key. Ron sat back in his chair and said, quietly, a word he normally tried not to say at work. He called Lauren Pierce. Lauren was still on 31, standing in the doorway of what would now be her expanded operational domain, talking to her personal assistant about office furniture. She picked up on the 4th ring. What? She said. We have a problem with the wire transfer system, Ron said. It's locked. And the way it's set up, Evelyn Carter is the only person who can... Evelyn doesn't work here anymore, Lauren said. Figure it out. I understand she doesn't work here, but the technical... Ron. Her voice had the particular flatness of someone accustomed to problems disappearing when she used that tone. Fix it. He sat with his phone in his hand for a moment after she hung up. Then he pulled up the system again and started working through it methodically, looking for a workaround. He was still looking 2 hours later when the trading system locked down. This one was different. This wasn't a credentials expiration. This was an active security protocol engaging, which was a different category of problem entirely. The trading platform that Blackwell Capital used for its portfolio management, the one that processed somewhere in the range of $40 million in daily transactions, had a fraud detection layer built into its backend. That layer had been designed 5 years ago by the then-new chief operations officer, who had arrived at Blackwell Capital with a background in financial security systems and had very quietly, very thoroughly, built a monitoring architecture that watched for specific patterns. Patterns like simultaneous changes to user access permissions across 3 or more executive accounts within a 72-hour window, which was exactly what had happened in the previous 18 hours, as Victor and Lauren had begun reassigning Evelyn's system access to other users in preparation for her removal. The security layer saw the pattern. It did what it had been designed to do. It flagged the account cluster as compromised and initiated a partial lockdown, freezing outgoing transactions above $50,000 pending a security review. A security review that required authorization from the chief operations officer. By noon, they had lost access to approximately 60% of outgoing transaction capability. The merger documentation was dependent on demonstrating clean transaction flow. The Meridian due diligence team had a system audit scheduled for the following week. Victor Blackwell was in his office when Ron Braddock and the head of legal, a man named Peter Cho, came to tell him about both problems at once. Ron stood with his laptop open, showing the error logs. Peter stood with his arms crossed, and the expression of someone calculating how much personal legal exposure he had accumulated in the past 6 hours. Victor listened. He stood at his window, the 42nd floor, the pale March sky, Lake Michigan glinting in the distance, and he listened to 2 men explain that the woman he'd fired that morning had built the operational infrastructure of this company so thoroughly, so completely, so specifically, that her removal had not been a subtraction. It had been a structural failure. "Call her," he said. Peter and Ron exchanged a look. "Call her," Victor said again. "Offer her, I don't know, offer her whatever she wants. Reinstatement, a bonus, whatever. Get her on the phone." Peter cleared his throat. "Victor, she left with a folder and a coffee mug. There's a reason she wasn't upset." Victor turned from the window. "What does that mean?" Peter looked at him steadily. "It means she knew this was coming, and it means she was ready for it, which means we need to ask what else she was ready for." Victor stared at him. "Call her," he said a third time, but his voice was different now. Peter called. The number rang 5 times and went to voicemail. He left a message. "Professional, neutral, wadsikum. We'd like to discuss the transition." He hung up and looked at Victor. Victor turned back to the window. Below, on the streets of Chicago, the city moved the way it always moved, dense and indifferent and enormous. Somewhere down there, in a coffee shop 6 blocks away, a portable hard drive with 4 years of financial records on it had changed hands. Nobody in the 42nd floor office knew that yet, but they were starting to understand that something had gone very wrong. The call Evelyn had been waiting for came at 12:18 p.m. Not from Victor. She hadn't expected Victor. From Peter Cho, which told her something about how the morning had gone, because Peter didn't make calls like this unless Victor had run out of other options. She let it ring. She was sitting in her sister Margaret's apartment in Lincoln Park, shoes off, feet tucked under her on the couch, working through a bowl of Margaret's leftover rice and the notes she'd been assembling for the past 3 days. Margaret was at work. The apartment was quiet and smelled like the candles Margaret bought in bulk from a shop in Wicker Park. Evelyn had not cried yet. She wasn't sure if she was going to. She had worked for Blackwell Capital for 15 years and 2 months. She had joined at 34 after 8 years at a financial infrastructure firm in Boston because Victor Blackwell had called her personally and told her he was building something significant and he needed someone who understood how to build systems that didn't break. She had believed him. She had believed that for a long time, not naively, she thought, but with the kind of calibrated faith that came from watching something actually work. The company had grown. The systems she'd built had held. Clients trusted the platform because the platform earned it. And then, somewhere in the past 3 years, something had changed. Victor had gotten impatient with the pace of legitimate growth, or bored with it. Or he'd met Gregor Holt, who had a Zurich office and a very smooth way of explaining why certain financial structures were technically not illegal in certain jurisdictions. The discovery 14 months ago had felt like stepping on a stair that wasn't there, just missing, the ground gone. She'd stood there for a moment in the middle of a quarterly review and thought, that can't be right. She'd checked. It was right. And once she'd seen it, she couldn't unsee it, and the more she looked, the more she found. She had not told anyone in the building. She had not confronted Victor. She had gone home and thought about it for a week, and she had arrived at the understanding that the only thing she could do that would actually help the employees, help the investors, help the clients who trusted this company, was to document everything properly and make sure it ended up with people who could act on it. She had spent the past 4 months doing exactly that, quietly, without urgency, without making mistakes. Victor had fired her before she was quite finished, but not before she was finished enough. Her phone buzzed again. A text from Dan, from the building. "Are you okay?" She texted back, "I'm fine. Don't worry about me. Take care of yourself." His response, "The trading system locked down. Ron's been on calls all morning." She set the phone down. She picked up the local notepad she'd been working through and found the page where she'd written, 3 weeks ago, in her own handwriting. "When they realize what's happening, they will try to reach you. Do not help them undo it. The lockdown is not meant to hurt the company. It is meant to stop the merger until investigators can act." She'd underlined that last sentence. She turned the notepad face down and finished her rice. At 2:15 p.m., the Meridian Technologies acquisition team, 11 people who had flown in from San Francisco and were staying at the Marriott on Michigan Avenue, received an email from their legal department flagging an anomaly in the Blackwell Capital transaction records that had been shared as part of the due diligence package. The email was brief and technical. It said that one of their forensic accountants had noticed that the transaction logs submitted for review did not match the format of logs generated by the software platform Blackwell claimed to use, and could someone from Blackwell please clarify? The Meridian team's lead attorney, a woman named Caroline Rhodes, read the email on her laptop in a conference room in the Marriott, and thought about it for several minutes before she picked up the phone. She called her counterpart at Blackwell Capital's legal team. He didn't answer. She called the secondary contact, voicemail. She called the main reception line of Blackwell Capital and asked to be connected to the COO's office. The receptionist put her on hold for an unusual length of time. When she came back, she said, "I'm sorry, Ms. Rhodes. I'm not sure who to connect you with right now. Can I have someone call you back?" Caroline Rhodes ended the call. She looked at her laptop for another moment. Then she opened a new email and began typing. By 4 p.m., the Meridian acquisition team had sent formal notice to Blackwell Capital that they were pausing the due diligence process pending clarification on several documentation questions. By 5:30, that notice had been forwarded to 3 board members and to Peter Cho's desk. By 6, Peter Cho was in Victor Blackwell's office, and neither of them was sitting down. "She gave them something," Peter said. "She had to have. There's no way Meridian flags the logs on their own in 24 hours unless someone pointed them at it." "Who would she give it to?" Victor said. Peter looked at him. "Victor? Who do you think?" The silence in the office was the kind that pressed against your ears. "I need you to get ahead of this," Victor said. "Call our outside counsel, tonight. We need to know what our exposure is before morning." Peter didn't say what he was thinking, which was, "We're past getting ahead of this." He said, "I'll make some calls." And he left. Victor stood alone at the window. The lake was dark now, the sky gone to gray-purple and city light. He thought about Evelyn Carter walking out of the boardroom that morning with her folder and her coffee mug and her complete, unnerving composure. He'd taken it for defeat. He'd watched her go and felt the satisfaction of a man who had executed a difficult decision cleanly. He understood now that he had not been watching defeat. He'd been watching the door close behind someone who had already finished what she came to do. He picked up his phone. He called Gregor Holt. The call went to voicemail. He called again. Voicemail. He sent a text. The text delivered. It did not show as read. He set the phone on the windowsill. He stood there for a long time, looking out at the city, thinking about every decision he had made in the past 18 months, sorting through them the way you sorted through items in a burning building, trying to decide what could still be saved. The answer, though he was not ready to arrive at it yet, was very little. Downstairs, in the parking structure, the space marked 47 was empty. It would stay empty for a while. Gregor Holt's phone went dark at 6:47 p.m. Chicago time, which was 1:47 a.m. in Zurich, which meant either he was asleep or he wasn't answering on purpose. Victor Blackwell stared at the unanswered text on his screen and understood, in a way he hadn't allowed himself to understand all day, that Gregor's silence was not a coincidence. He had known Gregor for 4 years. They had met at a private equity conference in Geneva, introduced by a mutual contact who described Gregor as someone who understood how money actually moved. Gregor was 62, quiet-voiced, with the kind of careful manners that came from spending decades in rooms where careless men got destroyed. He wore the same brand of Swiss watch every time Victor saw him. He never raised his voice. He had a way of explaining complicated financial arrangements that made them sound almost clean. Victor had trusted him because Gregor never seemed afraid. And people who weren't afraid, in Victor's experience, usually had good reasons not to be. Standing at his office window with the city going dark below him, Victor tried to reach back through 4 years of decisions and find the exact moment when this had stopped being manageable. He couldn't locate it precisely. That was the problem with bad decisions made incrementally. They didn't feel like decisions at the time. They felt like adjustments, small corrections, ways of smoothing out what would have been a difficult quarter, a disappointing audit, a number that didn't match the story he wanted to tell. He called Gregor one more time. Voicemail, again. He put his phone in his pocket and called his driver. What? Peter Cho did not go home that night. He sat in his office on the 31st floor with the door closed and his outside counsel, a man named Robert Vale, on speakerphone, and they went through the documentation that Peter had access to, the documentation he knew about, and tried to construct a picture of what was actually there. It was not a reassuring exercise. Walk me through the pension fund exposure, Vale said. He was in his car somewhere, Peter could tell from the acoustics, probably driving back from something else he'd been pulled away from. Approximately $62 million over a period of about 30 months, Peter said, moved through a series of fund transfers that were, look, on paper, they were structured as consulting fee disbursements. To Holt's firm. To a holding company that Holt controls, yes. The issue is that the source of some of those funds was the employee pension reserve. Some, Vale said. Most, Peter corrected. He hated saying it out loud. Most of those funds. The line was quiet for a moment. Outside Peter's window, the city hummed. Somewhere on this floor, someone's computer was still running. He could hear the faint white noise of it. Peter, Vale said, I need you to understand something. If there is an active investigation, and if Carter handed over documentation, primary source documentation, then the question we need to be asking is not how to make this go away. The question is how you, personally, navigate your own exposure. Peter had been waiting for this sentence all day. He'd been dreading it and expecting it in equal measure. I wasn't involved in the transfers, he said. Were you aware of them? He looked at his desk. I had reason to believe the consulting disbursements were irregular. When did you first have that reason? He thought about the answer honestly, which was unusual for him at this stage of any given crisis. Usually by this point he was already selecting the version of events that served him best. Tonight he was tired enough to think clearly. About 11 months ago, he said. Vale exhaled. Okay, here's what I want you to do. Don't talk to Victor tonight. Don't talk to Lauren. Don't delete anything and don't move anything. Go home, get some sleep if you can, and call me at 7 tomorrow morning. What about the Meridian notice? Meridian is the least of your problems right now, Vale said. Meridian is a transaction. A transaction can be unwound. The other thing, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Peter ended the call. He sat in his office for a long time after that, not looking at anything in particular. He thought about Evelyn. They had never been close. He was legal, she was operations, and their worlds had overlapped mainly in conference rooms and on contract reviews. But he'd always respected her. She had a way of asking questions in meetings that made you feel, if you weren't paying attention, like she was simply clarifying details. And then you'd realize, later, that the question had been a scalpel. He thought about the morning, the boardroom, the laughter. He thought about the fact that she had walked out of that room without a word, and he had sat there, and he had not said anything either. That, he thought, was probably something he would carry for a while. He shut off his computer, put on his coat, and took the elevator down to the garage. Lauren Pierce did not have the same evening. Lauren went home to her apartment in River North, poured herself a glass of wine, and spent 4 hours on the phone, with Victor's assistant trying to reach Victor, with the operations team trying to understand the scale of the system failure, with her own assistant fielding a cascade of calls from people who couldn't reach anyone above them. She kept the television on in the background with the sound off, the way she always did when she was working, the blue light of it moving across the walls of her living room. At 9 o'clock, she finally reached Victor. "Where are you?" she said. "Home." His voice was flat. She'd known him for 6 years, and she'd heard that flatness before, but usually in small doses. A bad quarter, a deal that fell through. Tonight it was different. It went all the way down. "Okay," she said. "Talk to me." "The system lockdowns are worse than Ron described. We can't process outgoing transactions above 50,000. The merger documentation team is asking questions we can't answer without Evelyn's authorization codes. Meridian is paused, and Gregor is not picking up his phone." Lauren put her wine down. "Gregor is not—" "I've called 12 times, Victor said. She stood up and walked to her window. River North stretched out below her. The restaurants and bars lit up. People who did not work at Blackwell Capital having a normal Thursday. "Victor, if Gregor's going dark, I know what it means." "Do you?" She kept her voice level because Lauren Pierce had survived in Victor Blackwell's orbit for 6 years by being the calmest person in the room during disasters, and she was not going to break that record tonight. Because if Gregor goes dark and Carter handed something to the feds, if both of those things are true at the same time, then we are not looking at a bad week. We are looking at a very different kind of problem. Victor didn't say anything. "Victor, I heard you. What do you want to do?" "I don't know yet," he said, which was not something she'd heard him say before. In 6 years, she had never heard Victor Blackwell say he didn't know. She stood at the window for a moment after they hung up. She looked at her reflection in the glass, overlaid on the city lights. She thought about the operations reorganization memo she had drafted 2 weeks ago, the one that proposed folding Evelyn's department into her own division. She thought about how good it had looked, how well-reasoned, how clean the org chart had been. She thought about the fact that her name was on that memo, that her digital signature was on a lot of things. She picked up her phone and called her own attorney. Evelyn slept well. She'd expected not to, had half anticipated lying awake in Margaret's spare room cataloging the day, but she was asleep by 10 and she stayed asleep until 6:15 when the pale spring light came through the curtains and she lay there for a minute listening to the sounds of the neighborhood waking up. Margaret was already in the kitchen when Evelyn came out. Margaret was 58, 4 years older than Evelyn, a middle school vice principal who had been waking up early her entire adult life and had the particular energy of someone who had made peace with that fact. "Coffee's ready," Margaret said. She looked at Evelyn carefully, the way you looked at someone after a hard thing. "How'd you sleep?" "Fine, actually." "Fine actually means you're not going to talk about it yet." "I'll talk about it," Evelyn said. "I just need coffee first." She poured a cup and sat at the kitchen table. The table was the same one their mother had owned, solid oak, nicked and water-stained and comfortable in the way things got after 30 years of use. "The news this morning," Margaret said, setting her own cup down across from Evelyn. "There's something about Blackwell Capital on the financial channel." Evelyn looked at her. "What kind of something?" "Trading anomalies, suspended transactions. They're calling it an internal operational review." Margaret watched her sister's face. "That wasn't an accident, was it?" "No," Evelyn said. Margaret was quiet for a moment. She had the same eyes as Evelyn, dark brown, direct, but she used them differently. Margaret's eyes asked questions. Evelyn's tended to give answers without being asked. "Are you going to be okay?" Margaret said. "I'm going to be fine," Evelyn said. "It's the other people I'm thinking about. The employees, 2,200 of them, and the investors, and the pension fund." She wrapped both hands around her mug. "The fraud is real, Maggie. I'm not doing this out of spite. I know how it looks." "It doesn't look like spite to me," Margaret said. "It looks like you've been carrying something very heavy for a long time, and you finally put it down." Evelyn looked at her sister. "Something like that," she said. She picked up her phone. A text from Marcus Webb. "Can you come in this morning? We have some questions and things are moving faster than expected." She typed back. "What time?" His response came in under a minute. 8:30. I'll send you the address. She looked at the time, 6:41. She had less than 2 hours. She finished her coffee. The FBI field office where Marcus Webb worked was not in a dramatic building. It was the kind of building that looked like an insurance company. Beige, bureaucratic, practical. Evelyn took a cab because she didn't want to deal with parking, and she arrived at 8:25 and was escorted to a conference room on the third floor that had fluorescent lights and a whiteboard covered in diagrams she wasn't supposed to see, and which someone hastily turned around when she walked in. Webb was there with 2 other agents, a younger woman named Tanya Ortiz, who had a legal pad and the focused energy of someone who had been at this since 6, and an older man named Frank DeLuca, who sat against the wall and took notes and didn't say much. "Thank you for coming in," Webb said. "Of course," Evelyn said. She sat down. She had brought her own folder, the physical copies of the documentation she'd given Webb on the drive, plus a set of handwritten notes that had been living in her home office for the past 3 months. "We've had our forensic team working on the drive overnight," Webb said. "I want to ask you about some specific entries, if you're up for it." "Yes," she said. "Okay." He opened a folder of his own. The transfer series labeled under Holt Meridian Consulting. "Help me understand the structure." Evelyn set her notes on the table. "Gregor Holt has a company called Holt Meridian Consulting registered in the Caymans. It has a parallel structure registered in Zurich. The Chicago office of Blackwell Capital made disbursements to both entities, labeled as strategic consulting fees. The disbursements began about 31 months ago. And the source of funds? Initially, legitimate operating revenue, but starting around the 18-month mark, the source shifted. Some disbursements were drawn from what the internal accounting system classified as reserve accounts." She paused. "Those reserve accounts are the pension fund buffer." Ortiz looked up from her legal pad. "Buffer meaning the pension fund itself is technically separate," Evelyn said. "The buffer is the liquidity reserve maintained to cover any short-term funding gaps in pension obligations. It's supposed to be untouchable. It's employees' retirement money, people who work there for 20, 30 years. She kept her voice flat. She had practiced keeping her voice flat when she talked about this part, because when she didn't practice it, something else came through. Approximately $62 million moved through those disbursements. The exact amount attributable to the pension buffer is still being determined, but my estimate is between 38 and 44 million. Webb nodded slowly. He had read the drive. He had probably already known most of this, but he was asking her to say it out loud in a room with witnesses for reasons she understood. "The altered audit files," he said. "Walk me through how that happened." Blackwell Capital uses a third-party audit platform. The platform generates logs that are exported quarterly as standardized files. What I found, 14 months ago, was a discrepancy between the export logs in our internal system and what had actually been submitted to the external auditors. She opened her folder and slid a page across the table. A printed comparison, 2 columns of numbers. These are the 2 versions. The internal system shows the true disbursement figures. The submitted audit shows figures that have been adjusted, consistently, specifically, in the line items that would have flagged the consulting disbursements as unusual. "Someone modified the export before submission," Ortiz said. "Yes." Evelyn pointed to a notation at the bottom of the page. "The modification timestamp is in the metadata. I pulled it before I left. It's in the drive." DeLuca, from the wall, said without looking up. "Who had access to modify the export?" "3 people," Evelyn said. "The CFO, the head of financial operations, and Victor Blackwell." The room was quiet for a moment. "The recordings," Webb said. "Have you listened to them recently?" "I reviewed them last week," she said, "to make sure the audio was clean." In the second recording, the one with Holt, there's a section where Blackwell refers to what he calls the safety valve. Do you know what that refers to? Evelyn had listened to that recording 17 times. She knew every pause, every word. "Yes," she said. "The safety valve is what Victor called a contingency, a plan to, if the fraud was discovered, redirect blame to the operations department, specifically to me." "To you," Webb said. "To me." She said it plainly. The theory was that if investigators found the disbursement irregularities, the documented explanation would be that the COO had made unauthorized modifications to the reserve accounts without executive knowledge. There were The recording confirms that steps were being taken to create documentation supporting that narrative. Ortiz had stopped writing. She was looking at Evelyn directly. He was building a frame. He was building a frame, Evelyn agreed, which is partly why the timeline mattered to me. I needed my documentation to be airtight before anything happened, because once it started moving, I knew what the defense strategy would be. Webb leaned back. He looked at her for a moment with the expression she'd come to recognize on him. Not skepticism, exactly, but the particular caution of someone who had seen enough cases to know that nothing was ever as clean as it looked in the first 24 hours. Is there anything on that drive or in those recordings that you're uncertain about? He said. Anything you'd characterize as ambiguous? The third recording, she said, the one where Victor and Lauren discuss the asset reclassification. Lauren's participation in that conversation it's real, it happened, but I want to be careful about characterizing her role versus Victor's. Victor initiates the discussion. Lauren asks clarifying questions. Whether she fully understood the legal implications of what they were discussing, I honestly don't know. Webb looked at her. That's a careful distinction to make on her behalf. I'm not making it on her behalf, Evelyn said. I'm making it because it's true. And because if you go into this with facts and you can support every single one of them, you don't lose anything. But if you overstate and somebody finds the seam in it, she didn't finish. You lose everything, he said. You lose everything, she said. He nodded. He closed his folder. We're going to need you available for the next several weeks, potentially as a witness. I can't give you a timeline yet on how this develops. I understand. You may want to retain your own attorney. I already have one, she said. He almost smiled again. He was doing that thing he'd done the previous day, starting a smile and catching it just before it arrived. Is there anything else you think we should know right now? She thought about it honestly. One thing, she said. Gregor Holt. He hasn't been picking up his phone since yesterday evening. Webb looked at her. How do you know that? Because I know Victor called him, she said. And I know Gregor well enough to know that if he's not answering Victor, it means he's already made a decision about how he's going to handle this. And that decision is probably not the one that helps Victor. You think Holt will cooperate? I think Gregor Holt is 62 years old and has a very nice life in Switzerland and a company in the Caymans that doesn't exist anymore the moment federal agencies start pulling its registration, Evelyn said. I think he'll make the calculation that cooperation costs him less than the alternative. She paused. But that's a guess. You should find him before Victor does. Webb was already writing something on a notepad. He nodded once without looking up. Thank you, Ms. Carter. She gathered her folder and stood. Ortiz walked her to the elevator. They rode down in silence for a moment, and then Ortiz said, Can I ask you something? Sure, Evelyn said. The security protocols you built into the trading system, the lockdown that triggered yesterday, did you design those specifically so that, did you know they would activate if someone tried to reassign your access? Evelyn looked at the elevator numbers. 7, 6, 5. I designed those protocols 5 years ago to protect the company against exactly the pattern of internal account manipulation that constitutes financial fraud, she said. The fact that the pattern was triggered by actions taken immediately after my termination. She considered how to finish this. That's an outcome of the design functioning as intended. Ortiz looked at her sideways. She had a small, careful smile. Right, she said. Functioning as intended. The elevator opened. Evelyn walked out into the lobby. By Friday morning, 30 hours after Evelyn had walked out of the boardroom, the situation at Blackwell Capital had the particular quality of a building that had lost its structural supports. Everything was still standing, technically. But the way it held itself had changed. The Meridian acquisition team had, per Caroline Rhodes' instruction, sent a second formal notice. This one was less diplomatic than the first. It used phrases like material discrepancies and due diligence obligations and potential breach of representations. Victor's outside counsel had been on the phone with Meridian's legal team for most of Thursday night and had not, by Friday morning, produced anything reassuring. The transaction system was still partially locked. Ron Braddock had been working on it with a team of outside IT contractors since Wednesday evening, and what he had determined was that the security architecture Evelyn had built into the back end was not something you bypassed. It was something you either had the keys to or you didn't. The keys lived on a security token registered to the COO position and on a backup key held by a third-party escrow firm that Evelyn had set up 5 years ago. The escrow firm had been notified of Evelyn's termination by Ron's team, and the escrow firm had, very politely, explained that they required a 30-day notification period before releasing the backup key to a new designee. 30 days was 3 weeks past the Meridian close date. Victor knew all of this by 7 a.m. Friday. He sat in his kitchen, the house in Lincoln Park. The kitchen his ex-wife had designed, and he had kept in the divorce because he liked the view. And he drank his coffee, and he read the summaries his assistant had compiled, and he thought about options. His attorney, a man named Wallace Chen, was expected at 9. Wallace was the expensive kind of attorney, which usually meant the effective kind. Victor had hired him 3 years ago for a different matter that had quietly resolved itself, and he had paid Wallace's retainer every quarter since because you never knew. He was beginning to understand what you never knew meant. His phone showed 37 unread messages. He scrolled through them without opening most. One was from Thomas Raines, the board member. The message said, "Calling you at 9. Important." Victor noted that Thomas, who had laughed in the boardroom on Wednesday morning, who had been the most reliable of Victor's board allies for 6 years, had not called himself available. He had announced he was calling. That distinction mattered. The loyalty calculations were beginning to shift. Victor had been in business long enough to recognize this stage. The moment when the people who had been most enthusiastically on your side started calculating whether enthusiasm was still the right posture. He had watched it happen to other men. He had sometimes been one of the people doing the calculating. He put his phone face down on the counter. He thought about Evelyn Carter. He had hired her because she was the best person for the job, which was something he had always been willing to say about himself, that he hired the best people. He had let her build the systems she needed to build, and he had not interfered because the systems worked and the company grew and the results were there. What he had not fully reckoned with in 15 years of watching her work was that she was not just building systems for the company. She was building them according to a specific set of principles. She believed, actually and genuinely believed, in the thing she was building. And systems built by people who genuinely believe in what they're building tend to be more durable, more thorough, and more consequential than systems built by people who are merely following instructions. He had known that she was good at her job. He had not known, had not thought, had not bothered to consider how completely the company was built around her understanding of it. He had mistaken the fact that she didn't demand things, didn't fight for credit, didn't perform her importance for an indication that her importance was smaller than it was. That mistake, he could see now, had been catastrophic. His phone buzzed. A text from Lauren. "Victor, I need you to call me. It's urgent." He picked up the phone. He put it back down. He poured more coffee. Wallace Chen arrived at 9:03 with a briefcase and the particular demeanor of someone who was about to charge a very large hourly rate to explain a very large problem. They sat in the living room, Victor on the couch, Wallace in the chair across from it, and Wallace opened his briefcase and set a legal pad on his knee and said, "Tell me everything, from the beginning." Victor told him. It took 45 minutes. Wallace wrote steadily throughout, asking questions in the particular way of attorneys who already knew most of the answers but needed you to say them. When Victor finished, Wallace put down his pen and looked at his notes. "All right," he said, "here is where we are. Tell me. You have federal exposure on 4 potential counts: wire fraud, securities fraud, pension fund misappropriation, and obstruction. The obstruction comes from the altered audit files, which the government will characterize as deliberate interference with a regulatory process." Wallace said this the way you'd read a weather report. Accurate, clear, not particularly emotional. "The question I need answered is how much of the documentation Carter provided is primary source versus reconstructed." "I don't know what she gave them," Victor said. "I know you don't. But from what you've told me, she was in a position to access primary source documents, original transfer records, original audit files, original communications. Is that accurate?" "Yes." "Then we operate under the assumption that the documentation is solid." Wallace picked up his pen again. "In that case, the negotiating posture shifts considerably. We are not in a position of denying the conduct. We are in a position of managing consequences." Victor looked at him. "What does that mean practically?" "It means that the path that produces the best outcome for you personally is not the path of resistance," Wallace said. "It's the path of cooperation. which is a conversation we should have very carefully in the next 48 to 72 hours, before the government's timeline overtakes ours. Victor was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the Friday morning traffic on the street was its usual moderate chaos. A neighbor's dog barked twice and went silent. "Lauren," he said, she's going to have her own attorney and her own calculation to make," Wallace said, cutting that sentence off. "You should not speak to Lauren about the substance of any of this. Not today. Not until I tell you otherwise." Victor nodded. "And Holt?" Wallace said, still not answering. Wallace wrote something down. He underlined it. "I'll make some inquiries about Holt's current situation. If he's already in contact with federal investigators—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. "One more thing. The board. You will receive calls from board members today. Do not discuss the legal situation with any of them. Thank them, tell them you're consulting counsel, end the call. Can you do that?" "Yes," Victor said. He sounded tired. He was tired. The sleep he'd gotten last night had been shallow and full of dreams about things he couldn't quite remember on waking, only the feeling of them. The sensation of standing in a very large space where all the exits were closing. Wallace stood up and put his legal pad back in his briefcase. "I'll be in touch by noon," he said. "In the meantime, do nothing." He let himself out. Victor sat in the living room in the Friday morning quiet and thought about the last time he had felt genuinely uncertain about how something would end. He couldn't remember a time. That was the truth of it. He had always been the person who knew how things would end because he had always been the person deciding. Even when things went badly, he had been the one shaping the badness, directing it away from himself and toward whatever or whoever was easiest to redirect it toward. He was not directing anything now. Everything was moving on its own, according to rules he hadn't written, toward a conclusion he couldn't see clearly. He picked up his phone. He opened the text thread with Evelyn Carter. There were exactly 4 messages in it, all from the past 18 months, all logistical. He didn't type anything. He looked at her name on the screen. Then he put the phone back down. In a beige building 6 blocks south of the federal courthouse, Marcus Webb was on his second cup of coffee and his 4th phone call of the morning, coordinating with the U.S. Attorney's Office about a search warrant application for Blackwell Capital's servers. The application would be filed before the end of the day. The warrant, Webb estimated, would be executed within 72 hours. And in a coffee shop in Lincoln Park, a different one from the day before, smaller, with exposed brick and a chalkboard menu, Evelyn Carter sat across from her attorney, a woman named Patricia Burke, and they went through the next phase of what needed to happen. "The employees," Evelyn said. "The pension fund exposure. Is there a mechanism for the investigation to prioritize restitution for fund holders?" "It's not automatic," Patricia said, "but it's something we can advocate for. It would require cooperation from the U.S. Attorney's Office in structuring the asset recovery." "What would it take to get that cooperation?" Patricia looked at her client. "More of what you've already been doing," she said. "Document everything. Make yourself available. Give them what they need to build the strongest possible case." "That I can do?" Evelyn said. She picked up her coffee. Through the window, Chicago went about its Friday. The buses and the cabs and the people walking fast with their collars up against the March wind. 15 years of her life had been in a building 2 miles east of where she was sitting. She didn't look in that direction. She looked at her attorney's notes, and she started asking the next set of questions. The search warrant was executed on a Tuesday morning, 11 days after Evelyn Carter had walked out of the boardroom with a ceramic mug and a folder. It happened at 7:14 a.m., before most of the staff had arrived, which was deliberate. Marcus Webb had pushed for the early window specifically to minimize disruption to employees who had nothing to do with any of this, people who had shown up every day for years and were about to have their workplace turned into a federal crime scene through no fault of their own. Webb had been doing this long enough to know that the people who got hurt in cases like this were rarely the people who deserved it, and he tried, where he could, to limit the collateral damage. 16 agents entered through the main lobby. Building security, to their credit, did not attempt anything complicated. The senior guard on duty, a man who had worked the building for 11 years and who had, by coincidence, been one of the people who signed Evelyn Carter's contractor access badge back when she first arrived, looked at the warrant, read it carefully, and stepped aside. The server room was on sub-level 2. 4 agents went there first. The financial records systems, the executive email archives, the backup drives for the audit platform, all of it was imaged within the first 90 minutes. Another team went to the executive floor, Victor's office, Lauren's office, the CFO's space, the conference room where the board meeting had been held 11 days earlier. Ron Braddock arrived at 7:45, walked off the elevator into a hallway full of federal agents and windbreakers, and stood there for a moment with his laptop bag on his shoulder, looking like a man trying to decide if he could reasonably turn around and go back down. He couldn't. Webb was waiting. "Mr. Braddock," Webb said, "thank you for coming in. I have some questions for you about the system architecture." Ron put his bag down on a chair. He looked at the agents moving through the hallway. "Do I need an attorney?" "That's always your right," Webb said. Ron looked at him for another second. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, I think I need an attorney." "There's a lobby downstairs," Webb said. "You're welcome to wait there while you make that call." He didn't say it unkindly. That was something Ron would think about later, that the federal agent had not been unkind about it. By 9 o'clock, when the normal workday would have been starting, a crowd had formed on the sidewalk outside. Some were employees who had arrived to find the building in the middle of an active federal operation and had been asked to wait. Some were passers-by who had stopped because the windbreakers and the equipment cases were hard to ignore. A news van from a local station was parked half a block down. By 9:30, there were two more. Victor Blackwell was not in the building. He had been advised by Wallace Chen very specifically not to be anywhere near headquarters that morning. He was at his house in Lincoln Park, in the same living room where he'd sat with Wallace 4 days earlier, watching the coverage on a television he normally only used for sports. The reporter outside his building, outside his company, was saying words like federal investigation and financial irregularities and sources close to the matter. The chyron at the bottom of the screen said, "Blackwell Capital Group under federal scrutiny, major merger in doubt." Victor watched the footage of his building, with agents moving in and out of it, and he felt something he wasn't entirely prepared to name. Not fear exactly, though fear was part of it. Something more like the sensation of watching a thing you built with your own hands being taken apart by strangers who didn't know or care what it had cost you to put it together. He picked up his phone. He had 17 new messages. He put it back down. Wallace had been clear. Don't speak to anyone without counsel present. Don't comment to media. Don't reach out to board members, to Lauren, to anyone connected to the business. Sit and wait, and let the lawyers manage what could be managed. Victor Blackwell had not sat and waited for anything in 30 years of business. He was not built for it. He had built himself specifically and deliberately into someone who acted, who moved first, who decided, who shaped the situation rather than being shaped by it. He was being shaped now, and he had no idea how to be still inside it. Lauren Pierce found out about the raid from Twitter. She had slept badly for the 4th night in a row and was on her couch with coffee at 7:20 when her phone lit up with a notification. Someone she followed in financial media had posted a single sentence: "Federal agents at Blackwell Capital on South Wacker, developing." She put her coffee down and opened her laptop. By the time she got her attorney on the phone, it was 7:38. Her attorney, a woman named Susan Hart, who specialized in white-collar defense, and who Lauren had retained 3 days ago after the conversation with Peter Cho that had left her sleepless, was already aware. "Don't go to the office," Susan said immediately. "I wasn't planning to." "Don't contact Victor. Don't contact anyone on the executive team. Don't post anything. Don't comment to anyone. Don't respond to emails from reporters." A pause. "Are you at home?" "Yes." "Stay there. I'll call you at 10. Lauren closed her laptop. She looked around her apartment, the clean lines of it, the furniture she'd chosen carefully, the way everything was arranged to project a particular kind of competent, curated life. She had worked for this apartment. She had worked for every piece of it. And she had worked for the career that paid for it, the title, the influence, the particular weight that came with being the person Victor Blackwell trusted most in a room. She thought about the memo, the reorganization memo with her name on it. She thought about the meetings where she had sat while Victor discussed things she hadn't entirely understood and had told herself she didn't need to understand. She thought about the recording Evelyn had made, the one Evelyn had mentioned to Webb, the one that captured Lauren asking clarifying questions while Victor laid out a plan to reclassify assets. She had asked those questions because she genuinely didn't understand what he was proposing. That was the truth. But she understood, sitting in her apartment with the news on her laptop and her attorney's number still on her screen, that the truth of her intentions was not necessarily the same thing as how those questions would sound on tape in a courtroom. She picked up her coffee. It had gone cold. She drank it anyway. But Peter Cho called Robert Vale at 7:51 and said, "It's happening." "I know," Vale said. "I've been watching. Don't go in." "I wasn't going to," Peter said. "Are you okay?" Peter was sitting at his kitchen table in his house in Oak Park, in his pajamas, with the news on the tablet his daughter had left at his place last weekend. His daughter was 26 and lived in Denver, and he hadn't called her yet. He wasn't sure what he would say. "Hey, there's some stuff going on at work," something like that. "I'm all right," he said. "Peter, in terms of your specific situation, I want to revisit what we discussed about cooperation." Peter had known this was coming. He'd known since the conversation earlier in the week. "Okay," he said. "The government is going to want to understand what the executive team knew and when they knew it. Your position, you're the head of legal. Your involvement in reviewing contracts, approving disbursement frameworks, signing off on certain filings, that creates a complicated picture, even if your actual knowledge of the fraud was limited." "It was limited," Peter said. "I knew something was irregular. I didn't know the scope." "I believe you," Vale said, "and a cooperating witness who can provide testimony about the internal decision-making environment, about the culture at the executive level, about what was known and what was deliberately kept opaque. That witness has significant value to the prosecution, and that value tends to translate into a more favorable outcome." Peter was quiet for a moment. He watched an aerial shot of his building on the tablet screen. The camera was from a helicopter or a drone, the angle looking down at the south end of South Walker, the building that had been his professional home for 8 years looking smaller than it ever looked from inside. "What would cooperation look like?" he said. "Proffer session first. You and I sit down with the U.S. Attorney's team, you describe what you knew and how you knew it, and we assess from there." Vale paused. "You would be truthful, completely. No spin, no selective memory, just what actually happened." Peter thought about the moment, 11 months ago, when he had looked at the disbursement summary on his screen and understood that what he was looking at was not something he could explain with any clean accounting logic. He thought about the decision he had made in that moment, not to ask questions, not to push, to put the document aside and tell himself it was probably something he didn't fully understand, and that was someone else's responsibility. That decision had been a choice. He hadn't named it as a choice at the time, but it had been one. "Set up the proffer," he said. By noon on Tuesday, the story had moved from local Chicago news to national coverage. The Wall Street Journal had a piece online with the headline, "Blackwell Capital Raid Throws Meridian Merger into Crisis." CNBC had 2 analysts on a segment discussing the transaction anomalies and what they might indicate. A financial blogger who covered fraud cases had already published a timeline of the Blackwell Capital irregularities, drawing on publicly available information that was accurate enough to make Victor's attorney wince when he read it. At 12:30, the Meridian Technologies Board of Directors voted formally to terminate the acquisition agreement. Caroline Rhodes, their lead attorney, issued a 1-paragraph statement that said, with considerable legal precision, nothing specific while communicating everything necessary. Victor's phone showed, at the moment he read about Meridian's decision, 62 unread messages. He had answered none of them. He called Wallace Chen. "It's done," he said when Wallace picked up. Meridian walked. "I saw," Wallace said. "That's not the priority right now. 14 months of work." "Victor." Wallace's voice was patient but firm, the voice of someone who had managed a lot of clients through a lot of crises and had learned that emotion, in these moments, was a luxury that cost more than it was worth. "The merger is the least of it. I need you to come to my office this afternoon. I've been in conversation with the U.S. Attorney's Office, and there are developments we need to discuss in person." "What developments?" A pause that lasted just slightly too long. "In person," Wallace said. 3 o'clock. Victor drove to Wallace's office in River North, past the streets he'd driven for 30 years, past the buildings he knew by name and history, past the restaurant where he'd signed 3 deals over dinner in the past decade. The city looked the same. It always looked the same when everything else was different. Wallace's office was on the 28th floor with windows that faced north toward Lincoln Park. Wallace met him at the door himself rather than having his assistant do it, which told Victor something, and led him to the private conference room rather than his office, which told him something else. "Sit down," Wallace said. Victor sat. "What's the development?" Gregor Holt made contact with federal investigators in Zurich through Swiss legal channels. He entered into a cooperation agreement with the U.S. Department of Justice late yesterday evening. Victor heard the words. He processed them individually and in sequence, and he understood each one, and then he sat with the sentence as a complete thing for a moment. "Gregor is cooperating," he said. "Yes." "Since when?" "The contact was initiated Thursday. He's been in discussions for 5 days." Victor thought about the unanswered calls. The 12 calls to a phone that had been answered by voicemail for 5 days while Gregor was, in Zurich, talking to federal investigators. What is he giving them? Everything we'd expect him to give them. Financial records from his end of the transactions. Communications. His own account of the relationship and the arrangement. Wallace folded his hands on the table. "Victor, the picture this builds combined with what Carter provided. It is not a picture that leaves a lot of room." The air conditioning in the conference room was set slightly too cold. Victor noticed that now, for no particular reason. "What are my options?" he said. Wallace looked at him. "Honestly, right now the best option is a proactive approach. Before the indictment, not after. A cooperation agreement offered from our side carries more weight than one negotiated after you're charged." "Cooperation," Victor said. The word felt strange in his mouth. It implied yielding, and he had spent 30 years specifically not yielding. "It's not an admission of guilt in the negotiation phase," Wallace said. "It's an exchange. You provide testimony and access. They consider the extent of your cooperation when determining what they recommend to the court. And if I don't cooperate?" Wallace was quiet for a moment. He was not a man who showed much on his face, but something moved through his expression now. Not pity, exactly, but something adjacent to it. "Then we defend the case fully, which I am prepared to do. But you need to understand what fully defending this case looks like, given the evidence they have from Carter and from Holt. The recordings, the primary source financial documentation, an insider witness who built the company's infrastructure and knows where every account entry came from, and now a cooperating co-conspirator from the external side." He paused. "I will fight for you. That's my job. But I won't mislead you about the probability distribution." Victor looked at the table. It was mahogany, similar to the table in his own boardroom. He thought about that boardroom. He thought about the morning that now felt both recent and very distant, standing at the head of that table, looking at Evelyn Carter and saying the words that had seemed, at the time, like the clean exercise of executive authority. "You're done." He had meant it to be decisive. He had meant it to be a closing, the end of something that had run its course, the removal of a piece that no longer fit the direction he wanted to go. He had not thought, standing there with the morning light on that long table and the board arranged around it, that what he was actually doing was pulling the last load-bearing wall out of his own building. "Give me until tomorrow morning," he said. "Of course," Wallace said, "but not longer than that." The trial was set for the following spring, 14 months after the raid. Federal cases moved at their own pace, unhurried and procedural, and those 14 months were a different kind of time from any Victor had experienced. His bail conditions restricted his travel. His assets were frozen in the categories related to the fraud, which was most of them. He lived in the Lincoln Park house, which he owned outright, and he drove his own car, and he went twice a week to a lawyer's office to prepare for a proceeding that was going to take everything. He did not cooperate in the end. Wallace had argued for it. Victor had sat with it for a week and decided he couldn't. It was not a rational decision, and he knew it wasn't rational. But there was something in him that could not find the position, could not locate the self that would sit across from prosecutors and confirm in detail everything he had done. He told himself it was about protecting his options. Wallace knew it wasn't. Lauren Pierce, through Susan Hart, entered into a limited cooperation agreement in the second month. She provided testimony about the internal culture and communication environment and what she knew and when. Her cooperation was genuine, and her culpability, when fully examined, was real but limited. She had participated in conversations without fully understanding their legal implications, and she had made the choice not to ask questions she probably should have asked. The agreement she reached reflected that. Peter Cho, through Robert Vale, cooperated fully. His testimony about the internal decision-making at Blackwell Capital, the culture of information control, the way executive decisions were structured to leave as few written trails as possible, the specific moment when Peter himself had understood that something was wrong and chosen silence, became one of the prosecution's clearest windows into how the fraud had operated on a day-to-day basis. Gregor Holt from Zurich provided financial records and testimony that the prosecution's forensic accounting team described as the single most complete picture of the external movement of funds they had seen in a case of this type. None of it had been possible without the foundation Evelyn had built. The recordings, the documentation, the internal records she'd preserved while they were still intact, those were the spine of everything that came after. Every other piece of evidence the prosecution developed was, in some way, a branch growing from that spine. The trial itself lasted 11 weeks. Courtroom 14B of the federal courthouse on South Dearborn was not particularly large or dramatic, a working room, functional and formal, with the particular atmosphere of a place where serious things happened at a methodical pace. Evelyn testified on the 8th day. She had been prepared extensively for this, had spent hours with the prosecution team going through the documentation and the recordings and the sequence of events, had been walked through every line of the financial records she'd preserved until she could discuss any of them from memory without needing to look at a page. Patricia Burke had sat with her through most of those sessions, quiet and watchful, occasionally redirecting when Evelyn's answers became more technical than a jury of non-specialists needed. She wore a gray suit that she'd bought specifically for this. Nothing she'd worn to Blackwell Capital. Nothing that would read as either aggressive or meek. She sat in the witness box and looked at the jury and told the truth for 6 hours across 2 days. The defense attorney was a man named Harold Greer, expensive and capable, with a courtroom presence that came from 30 years of doing exactly this. He was polished in the way that things got polished by use, not glittering, but worn smooth. He had a strategy, which was visible about 20 minutes into his cross-examination. He was going to try to position Evelyn as someone whose testimony was shaped by resentment. "Ms. Carter," he said, standing at the podium with a particular relaxed quality, "you were fired." "I was, yes." "Publicly, in front of the entire executive board." "Yes." "And that must have been humiliating." "It was unpleasant," Evelyn said. "Unpleasant." He repeated the word with just the right amount of lightness. "You'd given 15 years to this company, 15 years of your professional life, and you were dismissed in front of colleagues in a manner that by any standard was degrading. And you're asking this jury to believe that your response to that was not anger. I'm asking this jury to look at the documents," Evelyn said. Her voice was level. "The documents I collected over 14 months, beginning a year before I was fired. The recordings I made in states where single-party consent is legal. The financial records I preserved through proper channels and handed to federal investigators. I'm not asking anyone to take my word for anything. The evidence stands on its own." Greer paused. He had been cross-examining witnesses for 30 years, and he could read a jury, and what he read right now was not ideal for his client. He tried a different angle. "The security protocols you designed, vets, the ones that lock down the company's transaction systems after your termination, you designed those specifically to trigger in the event of a personnel change, didn't you?" "I designed them to detect patterns consistent with internal financial fraud," she said. "The specific pattern they detected was the simultaneous reassignment of executive account permissions across multiple users in a short time frame. That is a recognized signature of internal fraud preparation. It is also, in this specific case, what occurred immediately after my termination. Those two facts are related, but they're not the same thing. But the effect was to cripple the company's operations. The effect was to stop the company from completing a fraudulent merger," Evelyn said, "using a fraudulent balance sheet which would have harmed thousands of innocent investors and employees who had nothing to do with any of this." She paused. That was the intended effect of the system functioning correctly. Greer looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "No further questions," and sat down. The prosecution team, at their table, did not visibly react, but the junior attorney at the end of the row wrote something on her notepad and underlined it twice. The recordings were played on day 14. The courtroom was full. It had been full most days, but on the day the recordings were introduced, The overflow room outside was also running a feed. Journalists, financial analysts, representatives from institutional investor groups, and a significant number of people who had worked for Blackwell Capital and had the time and the need to come. Victor sat at the defense table in a charcoal suit and listened to his own voice come out of the courtroom speakers. The first recording was the conversation with Gregor Holt. Victor's voice was recognizable. The particular cadence of it, the way he moved through a business discussion, brisk and confident, and moving always toward a decision. He heard himself say, in a conference call from 13 months ago, the instructions about moving funds through the holding company structure. He heard Gregor's responses. Careful, technically precise. The voice of a man who had been doing this for a long time and knew exactly what each word was committing him to. He looked at his hands on the table. The second recording was the conversation with Lauren about the asset reclassification. Lauren was not in the courtroom. Her cooperation agreement had included provisions about her attendance. Victor listened to her voice, younger sounding somehow on tape than in real life, asking the question she'd asked. He remembered that conversation. He remembered thinking at the time that Lauren was being overly cautious about the terminology. He had explained it to her in terms that, he had believed, would satisfy her concerns. He heard himself explaining it now, in the courtroom, through speakers that made his voice sound slightly different than he heard it in his own head. The third recording was the one that did the most damage. It was the conversation in which he said, directly and without ambiguity, the words about redirecting blame to the operations department. He heard himself say Evelyn's name. He heard himself describe the documentation that would be created. He heard his own voice, calm and specific, laying out a plan to destroy the professional reputation of a woman who had built his company for 15 years. Someone in the gallery made a sound, not a word, just a sound. The judge looked up briefly. It was quiet again. Victor did not look at the jury. He looked at the table. He looked at the grain of the wood, and he thought about the conference room table in his own boardroom, the morning he'd fired her, the way the room had filled with that brief and stupid laughter. He had asked for that laughter. He had arranged the situation to produce it. He had wanted her diminished in front of witnesses, and she had walked out and given him exactly nothing in return. No anger, no tears, no defense. Just the quiet of a person who had already done what they needed to do. He understood now, in a way he had been unwilling to understand before, that what she'd given him in that room was not weakness. She had already won. She had known it when she walked in that morning. The termination had been, for her, the last step of a plan she'd been executing for 14 months. The thing that freed her to hand over the evidence without any complicating questions about employee loyalty or breach of contract. She had waited for him to fire her. She had needed him to fire her. And he had done it. In front of witnesses. With laughter. Harold Greer delivered his closing argument on day 31. It was technically accomplished. Greer was too experienced to deliver anything that wasn't. And it built carefully on the theme of a disgruntled employee, of evidence gathered with an agenda, of a woman who had constructed a case over 14 months with the patience and the deliberateness of someone who intended, from the beginning, to destroy a man. He used the word vendetta once, carefully, in a context that let it sit in the air without being directly asserted. The prosecution's closing was delivered by the lead assistant U.S. attorney, a woman named Diane Weiss, who had prosecuted financial fraud for 16 years and who did not use dramatic language or rhetorical flourish. She stood in front of the jury and walked through the evidence, piece by piece, in order, with the patience of someone who understood that the story told by documented facts was, when the facts were this clear, more powerful than any narrative you could impose on top of it. She played a short clip from the third recording one more time. Victor's voice, in that courtroom saying Evelyn's name. The defense has asked you to see Evelyn Carter as someone driven by anger, Diane Weiss said. The evidence asks you to see her as someone who built systems that told the truth, documented what she found, and gave it to the right people. You can decide which of those descriptions fits a woman who began collecting evidence 14 months before she was fired, who handed over primary source documentation, and who, when she sat in this witness box, invited you to not take her word for anything. She paused. The facts don't need her word. They speak fine on their own. The jury deliberated for 4 days. On the morning of the 5th day, they came back. Evelyn was not in the courthouse when the verdict was read. She had been told by Patricia Burke that she didn't need to be there, and she had decided that Patricia was right. She was in Margaret's apartment. She had been staying there, off and on, through the trial, using the time between testimony and the waiting to think about what came next. When Patricia called. "Guilty," Patricia said. "All 4 counts." Evelyn sat with that for a moment. The kitchen table, the oat grain and the water stains and the 30 years of it. "The pension fund," she said. "The restitution?" "It'll be part of sentencing," Patricia said. "But Diane Weiss is pushing hard on that. The asset recovery framework is already being built." "Okay," Evelyn said. "Evelyn, it's over." "It's not quite over," Evelyn said. "But okay." She put the phone down. Margaret was at work. The apartment was quiet. Through the window, Chicago was doing what Chicago did. Moving, indifferent, enormous, fully committed to its own purposes regardless of what any individual human life was doing. She picked up the phone again. She had a call to make. Not to anyone connected to the case, not to her attorney, not to the journalists who had been leaving messages for weeks. She called her niece, her sister's youngest daughter, the one who had painted the blue ceramic mug that Evelyn had taken from her office the morning she was fired, the only personal item she'd carried out. "Hey, Aunt Ev," her niece said. She had a college sophomore's voice, slightly distracted, clearly in the middle of something else. "Hey," Evelyn said. "I just wanted to say hi. Are you okay? Mom said the trial—" "I'm okay," Evelyn said. "How are your classes?" Her niece laughed a little. "You're calling me about my classes right now?" "I'm calling you because I wanted to talk to someone who isn't a lawyer," Evelyn said. Her niece laughed again, properly this time. "Fair enough," she said. "My classes are fine. My geology professor is kind of a nightmare, but I think I'm passing." "You're definitely passing," Evelyn said. "You've always been good at geology." "I've never taken geology before this semester." "Then you're definitely passing," Evelyn said. "I have very high confidence." She sat at the kitchen table and talked to her niece for 22 minutes about geology and a difficult roommate situation and a concert her niece had been to recently. The mug, the blue ceramic one with its slightly uneven handle and the glaze that had dripped a little on one side when it was fired, sat on the shelf above Margaret's stove where Evelyn had put it when she arrived. Outside, the March wind that had been following this story from the beginning had finally turned. The air coming off the lake had the first faint warmth in it, the kind that arrived in early spring and made no promises but was there nonetheless. Sentencing was 6 weeks away. Sentencing was set for a Wednesday in late April, 6 weeks after the verdict, in the same courtroom where the jury had delivered it. The morning was overcast, the sky the particular flat gray of a Midwest spring that couldn't decide whether it was done being winter. People lined up outside the courthouse on South Dearborn before 7, which the security staff noted was earlier than usual even for high-profile cases. Victor Blackwell arrived at 8:55 in a black car with Wallace Chen and a second attorney from Wallace's firm. He wore a dark blue suit and moved through the courthouse with the practiced composure of a man who had spent decades walking into rooms that were supposed to be impressed by him. The composure was real, in its way. It was not performed. It was simply what he had instead of anything else right now. The gallery was full. People who had worked at Blackwell Capital, attorneys who followed federal financial cases, a cluster of journalists in the rows behind the bar. And near the back, quiet and unremarkable, representatives from the pension fund advocacy group that had been working for the past 14 months alongside the federal asset recovery team. Ordinary people, most of them, the kind who showed up at government hearings with folders of documentation and didn't make noise but didn't go away either. Evelyn was not in the gallery. She was in a small room down the hall with Patricia Burke, waiting. She had been asked by the prosecution whether she wanted to submit a victim impact statement. She had thought about it seriously, had started writing something twice and stopped both times, and had finally told Diane Weiss that she didn't think it was necessary. Diane had accepted that without argument. She understood, Evelyn thought, that Evelyn's relationship to this proceeding was not the same as the relationship of someone who needed a statement read aloud to feel that something had been acknowledged. What Evelyn needed was the restitution framework. The rest was noise. "Are you doing all right?" Patricia asked. She had a coffee from the cart in the lobby and was holding it with both hands the way people held things when they were waiting. "I'm fine," Evelyn said. "I want to hear the restitution terms." "We'll have them," Patricia said. "I know," Evelyn said. "I want to hear them." Patricia nodded. She had been Evelyn's attorney for long enough now to understand that Evelyn's form of needing things was always practical. She didn't need vindication or ceremony. She needed to know that the specific outcomes she had spent 14 months working toward had actually been achieved. Down the hall, in courtroom 14B, Judge Raymond Calloway took his seat at 9 o'clock. Judge Calloway was 67, a former federal prosecutor himself, appointed to the bench 21 years ago. He had the face of a man who had heard every version of every argument available to human beings and had arrived at a state of patient, exacting clarity about which ones held up. He ran his courtroom with the minimum of theater and a maximum of precision, which was why cases assigned to him tended to move efficiently and why attorneys on both sides of the bar generally preferred him to the alternatives. He looked at the courtroom for a moment before speaking. He looked at Victor Blackwell at the defense table. He looked at the gallery. "We're here this morning for sentencing in the matter of United States versus Victor Allen Blackwell," he said. "Before we proceed to sentence, I'll hear from counsel and from the defendant, if he chooses to speak." Harold Greer went first. He had been preparing this argument for 6 weeks, and it was, as everything Greer did was, well constructed. He spoke about Victor's history of legitimate business success prior to the conduct at issue, about the employment and economic activity Blackwell Capital had generated over its history, about mitigating factors in the nature of the offense. He spoke carefully, and he did not overreach, because overreaching in front of Judge Calloway was the kind of mistake that cost you more than it gained. Diane Weiss spoke for the government. She was brief. She outlined the scope of the fraud, the amount, the duration, the number of people affected. She spoke specifically about the pension fund. She put a number on it: $41,300,000 drawn from the retirement savings of people who had worked for Blackwell Capital and its portfolio companies and who had trusted that the money withheld from their paychecks for that purpose was actually there, accumulating, waiting for them. "The guidelines recommend a sentence of between 18 and 22 years, she said. "The government recommends the higher end of that range in consideration of the scope of the conduct, the duration of the fraud, the deliberate steps taken to obstruct its discovery, and the specific impact on pension fund beneficiaries who are in many cases elderly and have limited ability to recover financially from losses of this magnitude." She sat down. Judge Calloway looked at the defense table. "Mr. Blackwell, you've elected to speak." Victor stood. He had written something and then not used it, had stood in his kitchen at 6 in the morning holding 3 handwritten pages and decided, for reasons he couldn't have fully articulated, to put them in a drawer. He had told Wallace he was going to speak without notes, and Wallace had given him a look that communicated professional concern without direct objection, because at this point Victor Blackwell was going to do what Victor Blackwell was going to do. "I understand what I did," Victor said. He looked at the judge. "I'm not going to describe it as a mistake in judgment. It was a series of decisions. Some of them I made because I was afraid of a bad quarter, and I told myself the ends justified the means. Some of them I made because I got used to a way of operating that I should have stopped." He paused. "I'm not here asking for sympathy. I know what the appropriate outcome of this proceeding is." He stopped. The courtroom was quiet. He could hear from outside the faint sound of traffic on South Dearborn. "The people who worked for this company," he said, "the pension fund, that's the part I find it difficult to think about clearly." He was not performing this. His voice had a roughness in it that wasn't theatrical. "I told myself those were abstractions. Numbers. Reserve accounts. I told myself the business needed what the business needed, and that was the worst of it. Not the crime itself, but the mechanism of thinking that made it possible. Making the people into abstractions." He stood there for another moment. Then he sat down. Wallace had told him afterward that it was the best thing he could have said under the circumstances, which was not praise for the sentiment, but a professional assessment of impact. Victor had not asked for that assessment. Judge Calloway reviewed his notes. He did not rush. That was one of the things about Calloway. He didn't perform deliberation, but he actually deliberated, which was a different thing. "Mr. Blackwell," he said, "I've reviewed the presentencing report, the government's recommendation, the defense submissions, and the victim impact statements provided by the pension fund beneficiary group." He looked up. What occurred here was not a momentary lapse. It was a sustained, systematic course of conduct over more than 2 years that exposed thousands of people to financial harm. People who were not in the room when decisions were made, who were not party to the conversations recorded in this evidence, who simply went to work and trusted that the institutions responsible for safeguarding their retirement were doing so honestly. He paused. The defendant's statement this morning is noted. It does not alter the nature or scope of the offense, but it is acknowledged. He looked at Victor directly. Victor Allen Blackwell, on count 1, wire fraud. I sentence you to 14 years in federal prison. On count 2, securities fraud. I sentence you to 12 years to run concurrently. On count 3, pension fund misappropriation. I sentence you to 8 years to run consecutively to count 1. On count 4, obstruction of regulatory process. I sentence you to 5 years to run concurrently. He set down his pen. Total term, 22 years. You're ordered to make full restitution to the pension fund beneficiaries in the amount of $41,300,000 to be drawn from identified and recovered assets. A restitution administrator will be appointed by this court to manage the distribution process. You are to report to federal custody within 30 days. He looked at the courtroom one more time. We're adjourned. The sound in the gallery was not dramatic. It was the sound of people exhaling, of chairs shifting, of the particular quality of air in a room where something has concluded. Victor sat for a moment before Wallace touched his arm. Then he stood and let himself be guided through the process of what came next, the procedural steps that followed a sentencing, the quiet and inevitable machinery of it. He shook Wallace's hand. He signed some forms. He walked out of the courtroom and down the hall and into the elevator and out through the lobby into the flat gray April morning. He stood on the courthouse steps for a moment. His driver was at the curb. The city moved around him. He thought about something his father had said to him a long time ago, when Victor was still young enough that his father's opinions felt like the law of the world. The thing about reputation is that you only get one. You can build it up your whole life and spend it in an afternoon. He hadn't thought about that in years. He thought about it now. He got in the car. Patricia Burke found Evelyn in the small room down the hall, still with her folder open on the table in front of her, and said, 22 years, full restitution, $41.3 million for the pension fund. Evelyn looked at her. They're appointing a restitution administrator, Patricia said. Diane Weiss is going to push for the distribution to begin within 60 days. Evelyn closed the folder. She set both hands flat on the table. 41.3, she said. The full amount, every penny. She sat with that for a moment. $41 million that had belonged to people who had worked morning shifts and overtime and decades of regular Tuesday afternoons, who had watched a portion of every paycheck disappear into an account they trusted, who had planned their retirements around numbers that had been quietly hollowing out beneath them without their knowledge. Okay, she said. Evelyn. Patricia sat down across from her. I want to say something. Sure. What you did. Collecting that evidence over 14 months, doing it carefully enough that none of it could be challenged, handing it over in a way that gave investigators what they needed to build a case this solid. That restitution happens because of that. Those $41 million go back to those people because of the work you did. I want you to know that I know that, and I think you should know it too. Evelyn looked at her. Patricia was not given to speeches. That was one of the reasons Evelyn liked her. Thank you, Evelyn said. Really? Okay, Patricia said. I have 3 more calls to make. Can I buy you lunch after? Yes, Evelyn said. Somewhere that doesn't have a television. The restitution process took 3 months to begin its first distributions and another 8 to complete them. It was unglamorous work, spreadsheets and claims forms and verification processes, and a call center that handled the questions of people who had received letters and weren't sure the letters were real. The restitution administrator, a former federal magistrate named Howard Garland, who did this kind of work with the energy of someone who found genuine satisfaction in it, ran the process with a thoroughness that Evelyn respected. She was not officially part of the restitution process. She had no formal role. But she had made herself available to Garland's team when they had technical questions about the financial records she'd preserved, and she had answered every one of those questions. She heard, through Patricia, about some of the beneficiaries. A woman named Ruth, who had worked in Blackwell Capital's document processing department for 26 years and had been 3 years from retirement. A man named Carl, who had worked facilities maintenance for 18 years and whose pension had been his primary retirement plan because he'd never been able to afford much additional savings on his salary. a group of administrative assistants who had banded together in the aftermath of the fraud to share information and navigate the claims process collectively. She didn't meet them. She thought about them, though. She thought about them specifically and individually, in the way that was harder and more honest than thinking about them as a category. On the day the first round of checks was distributed, a Wednesday in July, a genuinely hot Chicago summer day, she was in Margaret's kitchen again. She'd found her own apartment by then, a place in Wicker Park she'd rented month to month while she figured out what came next. But she was at Margaret's kitchen table because Margaret had made dinner, and Evelyn had no good reason to be anywhere else. Her phone buzzed. A text from Dan, who had navigated his own complicated path through the aftermath of everything, had cooperated fully with investigators in his own way, had testified briefly about the operational environment, and was now working for a logistics firm in the West Loop. First distributions went out today. Someone posted in the Blackwell Capital alumni group. A lot of people are crying. She held the phone for a moment. Good, she typed back. Dan responded with a thumbs up. Then, how are you doing? She thought about it. She typed, working on something. I'll tell you about it soon. That wasn't entirely true. She was more than working on something. She had been working on it for 2 months, quietly and with the same methodical patience she brought to everything, and it was further along than she'd told anyone yet. But she wasn't ready to make it real by saying it out loud to anyone except the 3 people she'd already talked to. The building on West Kinsey Street had been empty for 14 months. It had belonged to a logistics company that had folded during the post-pandemic supply chain collapse, and it sat on a block in the West Loop that was in the middle of the particular process those blocks went through. Some buildings renovated, some still waiting, the neighborhood deciding what it was going to become. The building was 6 stories, brick and steel, built in the 1970s, structurally sound in the ways that mattered, and outdated in the ways that could be fixed. Evelyn had been looking at it for 6 weeks before she made an offer. She had capital from her separation agreement. Blackwell Capital's legal team, in the months after the raid, had negotiated a severance settlement that reflected the reality that the company had terminated her specifically to prevent her from uncovering the fraud, and that characterization was untenable. She had other savings. She was careful with money in the way that people were careful with it when they'd grown up watching their parents not have enough. The offer she made on the building was under market but fair, and the building's owners accepted it because the alternative was another year of carrying costs on an empty property. She signed the purchase agreement on a Thursday morning. She drove to the building afterward and stood outside it on the sidewalk, looking up at it. 6 stories of brick with windows that needed cleaning and a loading dock on the east side and enough square footage to build something real. She stood there for a while. A man walking past with a dog glanced at her. A woman in her mid-50s standing on a sidewalk staring at a building, and then looked away. She went inside. The building smelled like dust and stale air and the particular emptiness of a space that had been holding its breath. She walked through each floor, slowly, the way she walked through systems she was learning, looking for what was load-bearing and what was cosmetic, what needed to be rebuilt, and what just needed to be cleaned. On the 3rd floor, she stood at a window that faced west, toward the neighborhood she'd driven through her whole life, and she started, in her head, to lay out the operational architecture of what she was going to build here. The company's name had come to her 3 months ago while she was writing notes in the small notebook she carried now, instead of work folders. She'd been thinking about what she actually wanted to do, not just what she was capable of doing, but what she wanted it to mean, and the word had arrived on the page before she consciously decided on it. Nixora. She'd looked at it for a moment. Then she'd written underneath it, logistics, infrastructure, accountability. Then, after a pause, built for the long term. She had told Patricia first because Patricia needed to know for legal structuring purposes. Then Margaret. Then Dan, whose response had been to send 3 separate texts in quick succession. Seriously? Your own company? When? Can I work there? She had answered, yes, soon, and we'll see. The first person she hired was not Dan. The first person she hired was a woman named Sylvia Reese, who had been the head of operations compliance at a mid-sized logistics company in Milwaukee, and who came with a reputation for being relentlessly organized and occasionally difficult to work with, which Evelyn took as a recommendation rather than a warning. Sylvia came down for an interview on a Tuesday, and they sat in the 3rd floor space of the Kinsey Street building. No furniture yet, just folding chairs Evelyn had brought from her car and a portable table. and talked for 3 hours. "Why are you leaving Milwaukee?" Evelyn asked. "The company's being acquired," Sylvia said, "and the acquiring company has a compliance culture I don't agree with." She said it plainly, without performance. "They prioritize speed over documentation. I'm not interested in that." "What's your non-negotiable?" Evelyn asked. Sylvia looked at her. She was 53, with reading glasses pushed up on her head, and a directness that Evelyn found comfortable. "Full access to the documentation systems. I don't want to find out about problems from outside. I want to be in the room where they originate." "That's the design," Evelyn said. "Is that what you said at the last place?" Sylvia asked. Evelyn looked at her steadily. "I was the last place," she said. "I built the systems that caught the fraud, and then I handed over the evidence." She paused. "The design principle of what I'm building here is that the people doing compliance work are not downstream of the people making decisions. They're lateral. The systems tell the truth regardless of whether that truth is convenient." Sylvia was quiet for a moment. "That's easy to say at the beginning." "I know," Evelyn said, "which is why it needs to be built in structurally rather than stated as a value. Values are nice. Architecture holds." Sylvia had accepted the offer the following day. Dan came on board 6 weeks after Sylvia, moving from the West Loop firm with 2 weeks' notice, and a relief in his voice when he called Evelyn that he tried to keep professional and didn't quite manage. She let him have the relief. He'd earned it. 3 months after that, she had 11 employees. 6 months after that, 23. The work was not glamorous. Logistics infrastructure consulting, operational systems design, compliance architecture for mid-sized companies that needed the kind of thorough building that larger firms charged too much for and smaller consultancies didn't have the depth to deliver. The clients came slowly, through referrals and through a reputation that built the same way Evelyn built everything, piece by piece, without shortcuts, with the understanding that shortcuts in systems work always cost you more than they saved. The former executives of Blackwell Capital dispersed in the way that people dispersed after something like this, each in a different direction, each carrying a different portion of the wreckage. Lauren Pierce had received, under her cooperation agreement, a sentence of 3 years probation and a substantial fine. She had lost her ability to serve as an officer or director of any publicly traded company for 7 years. She left Chicago and moved to Seattle, where she had family, and started over in a way that was quieter and more uncertain than any version of her life she'd planned. She was not villainous in the end, and she was not a victim. She was a person who had made a series of choices without fully accounting for what those choices made possible. And she was living with that accounting now. Ron Braddock had cooperated fully and faced no charges. His knowledge of the fraud had been operational rather than participatory, and his willingness to testify had been unambiguous. He found a new position at a technology firm in the suburbs and did not talk publicly about Blackwell Capital in interviews, which was a form of dignity he permitted himself. Peter Cho's story was more complicated. His cooperation had been genuine, and his testimony had been material to the conviction. His exposure had resulted in a settlement that included a fine and a 2-year suspension from legal practice. He used those 2 years, he would say later, to think more carefully than he ever had before about the difference between knowing something was wrong and doing something about it. He went back to practice afterward in a smaller firm, doing quieter work, and brought to it a kind of attention he hadn't had before. He called Evelyn once, about a year after the trial, and said, "I should have said something that morning. In the boardroom, I should have said something." She had sat with that for a moment. "I know," she said, "but you told the truth when it mattered." "That's a very generous way to look at it," he said. "I'm not being generous," she said. "I'm being accurate. Generous would be saying, it doesn't matter that you waited, it matters. But you did the right thing in the end." He was quiet for a moment. "Thank you," he said. "Take care of yourself, Peter," she said. She meant it. Gregor Holt remained in Switzerland. His cooperation agreement with the U.S. Department of Justice had been extensive and had resulted in a suspended sentence on the condition of specific behaviors and ongoing cooperation with related international financial investigations. His company in the Caymans had been dissolved. His company in Zurich operated in a significantly reduced capacity under regulatory supervision. He was a smaller man, in all the ways that mattered to him, than he had been 2 years before. He had sent Evelyn an email once. She had no idea how he'd gotten her address, and she'd chosen not to find out. That said, in its entirety, What you built was very good. I know that is an odd thing to say. It is true. She had read it twice and then moved it to a folder and not responded. Victor Blackwell reported to federal custody on a Tuesday in late May, 31 days after sentencing, in the manner required by his bail conditions. Wallace Chen accompanied him to the reporting location, a federal processing facility outside Chicago, and shook his hand when they arrived and said the things attorneys said in those moments: professional, human, finite. Victor had put the Lincoln Park house on the market the week before. The sale would go toward restitution. The car, various financial accounts that hadn't been frozen at the time of the asset recovery. All of it moving through the restitution framework, piece by piece, into the fund that was working its way back to the people it had come from. He had one call he'd wanted to make before he reported, and he had talked himself out of it 4 times over the previous week. On the Monday night before he reported, he finally made it. Evelyn's phone rang at 8:47. She looked at the screen. She sat with it for 2 rings. She picked up. "I know you don't owe me anything," Victor said. He had clearly thought about how to start this, and he'd gone with the direct approach, which she respected even now. "I'm not calling for absolution or whatever. I'm calling because I'm reporting tomorrow, and there's something I wanted to say before I did." "Okay," she said. "I fired you in front of a room full of people," he said, "and they laughed, and I knew they would laugh. I set that up. I wanted that." "Victor, let me finish," he said. Not harshly, just clearly. "I wanted you small in that room. After 15 years of watching you build everything that actually kept that company alive, I wanted you small. And what I understand now is that it wasn't really about you. It was about me being afraid of what you knew and what you were capable of and wanting to cut that down to something I could feel in control of." A pause. "That's probably not news to you." "No," she said. "I built a company with your work," he said, "and I tried to steal from the people in it, and then I tried to frame you for it. And you didn't retaliate, you just documented it and handed it over." He paused again. "I've been trying to understand that. How you did that without it being about revenge." She thought about it. The honest answer, she thought, was complicated. She had been angry, genuinely and at some depth, in ways she hadn't always admitted to herself. The anger had been real. But the anger hadn't driven the decisions. The decisions had been driven by something else, by the people she kept thinking about specifically and individually, the Ruth and the Carl and all the others, the ones who had nothing to do with any of it and who needed someone to do something. "The people in the pension fund," she said. "That's why. Not you. Not what you did to me. The people who had nothing to do with any of this and were going to get hurt because you made decisions in rooms they weren't in." She paused. "I've been angry at you. I'm not going to pretend I wasn't, but the work wasn't about the anger." Silence on the line. "The company you started," he said. "Nixora. I heard about it." "Yes. Is it going well?" She looked around her office on the 3rd floor of the Kinsey Street building. Real furniture now, real systems, a whiteboard covered in operational diagrams, the blue ceramic mug on the corner of her desk. "It's going," she said. "Good," he said. And then, very quietly, "I'm sorry, Evelyn." She sat with that. The apartment window across the alley had a light on, someone moving around in a kitchen, ordinary and distant. "I know," she said. "Take care of yourself, Victor." She ended the call. She sat in her office for a long time after that, not thinking about the call particularly, just letting the quiet settle around her. The building had sounds at night. The HVAC system, the occasional car on Kinsey, the building speaking its ordinary language. She had been learning it over the past months, the way you learned the sounds of any place you were going to stay for a while. She picked up her notebook. She wrote a few things about a project she was working on. Nothing dramatic, just operational notes, the kind she'd been writing her whole career. Then she put the pen down and looked at the whiteboard and thought about what needed to happen next week. There was a lot that needed to happen next week. That was the thing about building something real. The list of what needed to happen never got shorter. It just changed. And the work kept coming, and you kept meeting it, and if you'd built it right, it held. The first full year of Nixora went by the way first years went, badly in some months, better in others, and never quite the way the projections said it would. Evelyn had known this going in. She had built enough systems in her life to understand that the gap between the plan and the reality was not a sign of failure. It was just the nature of building things. Plans were models. Reality was messier than any model, and the job was to keep adjusting without losing sight of what you were actually trying to do. In January, they lost a client they'd been counting on, a mid-sized shipping company in Indianapolis that had been close to signing a compliance architecture contract and then got acquired by a larger firm that had its own systems. Sylvia had taken the news with a flatness that communicated, without saying anything, that she was recalculating. Evelyn had looked at the revenue projection for the quarter and told herself out loud, standing in the office alone at 7 in the evening, "Okay, adjust, keep going." In February, a referral came through from an unexpected direction. The recommendation came from Howard Garland, the restitution administrator who had managed the Blackwell Capital Pension Fund distribution. Garland knew, through the work of the past year, how carefully Evelyn built things. He had referred her to the board of a regional logistics nonprofit that was rebuilding its operational infrastructure after a governance failure that had cost it 2 major city contracts. Evelyn met with them on a Tuesday afternoon. The board chair was a woman named Dolores Bryant, 61, a retired city planner with the specific competence of someone who had spent decades making public systems work despite every conceivable obstacle. She sat across from Evelyn in a conference room at the nonprofit's offices on the south side and looked at her steadily and said, "We need someone who can build something that doesn't break when we're not looking at it." "That's what we do," Evelyn said. "I've heard that before," Dolores said, "from people who meant it and people who didn't." "What do you need to see to believe it?" Evelyn asked. Dolores looked at her for a moment. "Show me how the system handles a bad month," she said. "Not a good one. Anyone can show me what works when everything's fine. Show me the failure points and what happens when they're triggered." It was, Evelyn thought, the best question anyone had asked her since she started this company. It was the question she would have asked. She opened her laptop and showed her. The contract was signed 3 weeks later. It was not large by any measure that would have mattered at Blackwell Capital, but it was real, and it was built on exactly the terms Evelyn had built the company to operate on. And it led, because that was how referrals actually worked, slowly and through trust, to 2 more contracts within 6 months, both from organizations in the city's infrastructure network that Dolores Bryant knew and had spoken to. Dan settled into his role with the particular relief of a person who had been operating in the wrong environment for too long and had finally found one that fit. He was Nexora's head of client operations, which meant he managed the day-to-day relationship work that Evelyn was constitutionally less patient with. The check-in calls, the status updates, the communication that kept clients feeling informed and cared for even when the underlying work was going exactly as planned, and there was nothing dramatic to report. He was good at it. He had always been good at it, which Evelyn had known and which his years at Blackwell Capital had not fully let him demonstrate, because the culture there had valued a certain kind of aggressive performance over the quieter competencies that actually kept things running. 6 months in, he came to Evelyn's office on a Thursday morning and closed the door, which he only did when something was on his mind. "What?" she said. He sat down. He had his phone in his hand. "There's a thing on LinkedIn," he said, "about the Blackwell Capital alumni. Someone started a group, and there are a lot of people in it. People from operations, from compliance, from the support teams. Some of them are doing okay, some of them are still trying to figure out where to land." She looked at him. "I'm not suggesting anything specific," he said. I thought you should know." She considered that for a moment. Nexora had 23 employees now. It had a budget. It did not have unlimited capacity to absorb people out of loyalty. She was not in the business of building monuments to the past. "Send me the group link," she said. She spent an hour that evening looking through it. Hundreds of former Blackwell Capital employees scattered, some into new jobs, some still looking, some who had moved cities, some who had stayed in Chicago and were rebuilding in ways that were slower and harder than they should have been. She recognized some of the names. A woman from the document processing team, whose name she knew from operational emails, but whose face she'd probably passed in the elevator without registering. A man from facilities. Several people from the compliance support team that had, technically, been downstream of Evelyn's department. She made a list. Not a large list. She was realistic about what Nexora could actually support at its current scale. But 9 names, people whose backgrounds and roles seemed aligned with what the company actually needed in the next growth phase. She sent the list to Sylvia and Dan the next morning with a note. "Review these." Let me know who makes sense for an outreach conversation. We're not doing charity. We're looking for people who are good and happen to need a door. Sylvia's response, 40 minutes later, was, 3 of these I already know. 2 of them are very good. 1 of them is exceptional. Then I'll set up calls. The exceptional one was a woman named Keisha Ford, who had been a systems analyst in Blackwell Capital's operations compliance team for 6 years, and who had, in the aftermath of the fraud and the investigation, spent a year doing contract work that paid her bills but didn't use what she actually knew how to do. She came in for a conversation, not an interview, exactly. Evelyn had stopped using that word because the power dynamic it created wasn't useful, and they sat in the third-floor office and talked for an hour and a half about systems design philosophy. Keisha was 38, quiet in the way that meant she was thinking rather than deferring, and she had opinions about compliance architecture that were specific and well-reasoned and occasionally inconvenient. When Evelyn suggested an approach to a problem they were discussing abstractly, Keisha said, "That works in the short term, but there's a failure mode at the 18-month mark that I'd want to address before implementation." Evelyn stopped. "Walk me through it." Keisha walked her through it. She was right. "Okay," Evelyn said. "When can you start?" In the second year, Nexora moved from 23 employees to 41. The Kinsey Street building, which had seemed large when Evelyn first walked through it, started to feel closer to the right size. They took the 5th floor that had been sitting empty and built it out for the expanding compliance team. The loading dock on the east side became, through a combination of practical necessity and Evelyn's particular aesthetic of functionality, a workspace for the systems integration team that managed client implementations. The work was unglamorous in ways that Evelyn genuinely liked. There were no billion-dollar mergers, no executive galas, no press coverage of the kind that had surrounded Blackwell Capital. There were systems that got built correctly and held up under real conditions, and clients who called not because there was a crisis, but because the work had gone well and they wanted to extend the relationship. And Monday mornings, when people showed up and got to work in an environment that didn't require them to perform more certainty than they had. Sylvia, 8 months in, had come to Evelyn after a difficult client meeting and said, "I want to change how we document the risk assessment phase. The current format is good, but there's a version that would be better." In her previous position, Sylvia would have needed to submit a formal proposal, have it reviewed by 2 levels above her, wait for a decision that might or might not come, and then implement something that had been modified by people who didn't fully understand the operational context. Evelyn had looked at her across the desk and said, "Draft it and show me." Sylvia had the draft on Evelyn's desk by the following morning. They had spent an hour going through it. 2 weeks later, it was the standard. That was the thing Evelyn had wanted to build that she couldn't have named precisely at the beginning. Not just a company with good systems, but a company where the people who did the work had real authority over how the work was done. She had spent 15 years at Blackwell Capital, making the systems work despite a culture that was not, at its core, interested in the systems. She had done it anyway, because the work mattered, and the people downstream of the work mattered, but it had cost something. It had cost the particular daily friction of operating inside a structure that was always slightly at odds with what you were trying to do. Nexora was not frictionless. Nothing real was frictionless. But the friction was different. It was the friction of genuine problems, of real constraints, of disagreements between capable people who saw things differently. It was not the friction of having to protect your work from the people nominally in charge of it. Tech. In the spring of the second year, Evelyn got a call from a city official named Marcus Park, who was deputy director of Chicago's Office of Emergency Management and Communications. He had been referred by Dolores Bryant, who seemed to have decided that Evelyn was someone she was going to recommend to every competent person she knew. "We have a situation," Park said on the phone. He had a city official's directness. Not rude, just efficient. "Our logistics coordination system for emergency response failed during the February snowstorm. Not catastrophically, but badly enough that we missed a 6-hour window on supply distribution in 3 neighborhoods on the south side. 6 hours in a winter emergency is significant." "Yes," Evelyn said, "it is. I need someone to come in and look at the architecture, figure out where it failed and why, and build something that doesn't have that failure mode." "What's your timeline?" she asked. "Before next winter," he said. "I know that sounds aggressive." "It is aggressive," she said, "but it's the right timeline. The work has to be live before you need it, not during." He paused. She had said the thing he expected to push back on, and instead she had agreed with his reasoning. That earned her something. Can you come in next week? Wednesday, she said. Send me everything you have on the February failure before then. She spent the weekend before that Wednesday reading the incident reports, the system logs, the after-action documentation that Park's team had assembled. She took notes in the small notebook she carried everywhere. She asked Keisha to look at the technical architecture documentation and come to the meeting with her. They went in on Wednesday, the two of them, and spent 3 hours with Park and his team going through what had happened. It was detailed, technical work, the kind of conversation that required real familiarity with how logistics systems behaved under load and what happened to communication protocols when the inputs exceeded the design parameters. Keisha asked questions that clarified things the city's own team hadn't fully articulated to themselves. Evelyn listened more than she spoke for the first 2 hours, building a picture. At the end, Park looked at her and said, "What do you think?" "The architecture isn't wrong," she said. "The design assumptions are wrong. The system was built for a distribution network that functions normally with stress added. An emergency is not a normal distribution network with stress. It's a different kind of network with different behavior patterns, and the system doesn't account for that." She paused. "You need a parallel architecture that activates specifically under emergency conditions, with different protocols and different triggers. Not an upgrade of what you have. A separate system that talks to what you have." Park was quiet for a moment. "How long to build that?" 7 months, Evelyn said. "If we start now, and the data access is clean." "And the cost?" She named a number. It was not a small number. It was an accurate number, which was a different thing. Park looked at his deputy. His deputy looked at her spreadsheet. "That's within the range we discussed," she said. 7 months, Park said. He looked at Evelyn. "What do you need from us to start?" "Full access to the incident data and the current system architecture," she said. "A point of contact on your team who has actual authority and actual availability. And the understanding that if I find something that needs to change beyond what we've scoped today, I'll tell you directly." "That's an unusual thing to put in the agreement," he said. "It's the most important thing in the agreement," she said. He held her gaze for a moment. "Agreed," he said. The city project was the largest thing Nixora had taken on, and it was also the most visible, which brought with it a category of attention Evelyn had been deliberately avoiding. A reporter from the Tribune wrote a piece about the contract, framed inevitably around the Blackwell Capital story, the fired COO who had exposed the fraud and then started her own company and was now rebuilding the city's emergency logistics. The piece was accurate as far as it went, and it used a photograph that someone had taken without her permission at a public event, which was legal and irritating in equal measure. She declined 3 follow-up interview requests. She did eventually agree to speak with a woman named Rachel Torres, who wrote about business and leadership for a publication aimed at professional women in their 40s and 50s. The request had come with a note from Rachel that was direct enough to be interesting. "I'm not interested in the revenge narrative. I'm interested in what you actually built and how you built it. Those are different stories." They met at a coffee shop in the West Loop, not far from the Kinsey Street building. Rachel was 46, with a recorder she set on the table between them and a notebook she barely used. She was a good interviewer in the specific sense that she asked real questions and then actually listened to the answers instead of waiting to ask the next question. "The thing I keep reading about you," Rachel said, "is the patience. That you collected evidence for 14 months before anything happened. That you built the systems that eventually caught the fraud years before the fraud even started. That you waited." She tilted her head. "Is that accurate? The patience?" Evelyn thought about it honestly. "It wasn't patience in the sense of sitting still," she said. "It was, I had a clear sense of what the right outcome was. And the right outcome required a specific kind of evidence gathered in a specific way. Rushing would have produced something weaker. Weaker evidence means a weaker case means fewer people get made whole." She picked up her coffee. "I wasn't being patient. I was being accurate." "Those are different things," Rachel said. "Yes." "Do you think about the morning he fired you?" Evelyn considered the question. "Sometimes," she said. "Not in the way I used to think I would. I think I expected to feel angrier about it, retrospectively, than I do. What I actually feel is," she searched for the honest word, "sad. A little. for the waste of it. 15 years of work, and it ended in a room full of people laughing. She set the cup down. That's not about me. That's about what it means when a culture gets so comfortable with contempt that contempt becomes the language. Rachel wrote something in her notebook. What did you take from that building when you left? A ceramic mug my niece made me, a photograph of me and my assistant, the folder I'd been carrying. She paused. I didn't want anything else from that place. I had already taken the important things. The evidence, Rachel said. The knowledge, Evelyn said. The evidence was documentation. The knowledge was understanding what I had built and what it was worth and what it would take to build something better. She looked at the table for a moment. I spent 15 years at Blackwell Capital building systems I was proud of, inside a structure that was ultimately using those systems to cover up theft. That's a complicated thing to carry. I still carry it. Rachel looked at her. Does it make you angry? It makes me careful, Evelyn said. There's a version of angry that's useful, the kind that tells you something is wrong and pushes you to fix it. And there's a version that just eats the years. I tried to stay in the first category. She paused. I wasn't always successful. Rachel wrote something else. Then she looked up. If you could say one thing to the women reading this, women in their 50s, in your position, who've given everything to a job and found out it didn't go the way they planned, I'd say two things, Evelyn said. First, the work you do is yours, even when the institution isn't. The knowledge, the capability, the systems you built, those belong to you in a way that a termination can't touch. They fired me. They couldn't fire what I knew. She paused. And second, when you're building something, build it for the people downstream of it, not for the people above you. The people above you will come and go. The people downstream, the ones who depend on what you build to work, those are the ones who matter. Build for them. Rachel looked at her for a moment. Then she nodded and clicked off her recorder. The city's emergency logistics system went live in October, 11 days ahead of Evelyn's 7-month estimate, which was not something she'd planned, but was the result of the city's data access having been cleaner than expected, and Keisha's team having solved the protocol integration problem 6 weeks early. Evelyn noted the early completion with the same response she would have given to a late one. She documented it, understood why it happened, filed the learning for the next project. Marcus Park sent an email the day the system went live. Testing complete. All protocols functional. For the record, I wasn't sure about the separate architecture approach. I am now. Then, below that, a single line that was clearly not from his official communications voice. Thank you for not letting us underscope this. She saved that email. She didn't do that often. The winter that followed was harder than average. 2 significant snowstorms and a cold snap in January that pushed the emergency response system through conditions that were close to the design parameters. The system held. The 6-hour gap that had happened in February the previous year did not reappear. Supply distribution reached the 3 Southside neighborhoods that had been underserved the year before within 2 hours of the storm's peak. She found out about it from Park in a brief text at 11 at night after the January storm. System performed. Southside distribution hit 2-hour target. I'm buying you dinner when things thaw out. She read the text in her apartment in Wicker Park. She had bought the apartment by then, had stopped thinking of herself as temporary in this next version of her life. And she thought about what it meant, specifically and practically. Families who had heat because the distribution system had worked. Elderly people in buildings where the emergency supplies had arrived before the cold became dangerous. Children who had eaten because the logistics chain had held. This was the thing she had tried to explain to Rachel Torres and hadn't quite found the words for in that coffee shop. This was why the work had never been about Victor Blackwell. Not really. Not at its core. It had been about this. About systems that served people who depended on them. About the downstream always, the people who never came to the meetings where decisions were made, but who lived inside the consequences of those decisions. She put her phone down and looked out the window of her apartment. The city was white and quiet under the snow, the way Chicago went quiet in storms. Not fully, never fully, but with a hush that sat over everything like a held breath. She thought about something Margaret had said to her 1.5 years ago, at the kitchen table with the oak grain and the water stains. It looks like you've been carrying something very heavy for a long time and you finally put it down. She'd been right, Evelyn thought. Partly right. What Evelyn had put down was the version of the weight that had no purpose. The part that was pure endurance, the grinding of staying in a structure that was slowly eating what she was trying to build, that she had put down. But she hadn't put down the work itself. She had picked it up again differently, with her own hands, in her own building, on her own terms. And that weight, the good kind, the kind that meant you were lifting something real, she carried that still, and she expected she would for a long time. 3 years after Evelyn had walked out of that boardroom, Nixora had 67 employees and offices on the 3rd, 4th, and 5th floors of the Kinsey Street building. The 6th floor was under negotiation. 3 cities, Chicago, Cincinnati, and Indianapolis, were active clients. 2 more were in conversation. A regional hospital network had brought them in to redesign their supply chain logistics after a compliance failure that had cost them 2 regulatory approvals. A utility company in downstate Illinois was 3 months into an infrastructure rebuild. None of it had arrived cleanly. The Cincinnati contract had fallen through twice before it happened. The hospital project had a difficult first 4 months when the scope turned out to be larger than anyone had initially understood. And there had been a week in month 3 where Evelyn had sat at her desk at 10 at night looking at a project log that was not where she needed it to be and felt the specific exhaustion of someone who had bitten off something large. She had called Sylvia, who had been working late in the office 2 floors below, and Sylvia had come up and sat down, and they had gone through the project log together until 1 in the morning and found 3 things that needed to change and changed them. The project had come back on track. That was the thing about Sylvia. Evelyn had come to understand. She was not easy to work with in the sense that she never accepted a problem at face value, never let a good enough answer stand if a better one was findable, never softened bad news to protect someone's feelings. She was exactly what she had told Evelyn she was in that first conversation in the empty 3rd floor space, someone who wanted full access to where problems originated. And having someone like that, someone who actually saw the seams in things, turned out to be more valuable than any amount of smooth execution. Keisha had become, in ways Evelyn hadn't fully anticipated, the technical heart of the company. The work she did with clients on systems architecture had a particular quality to it. She could see the failure points that wouldn't appear for 18 months, could anticipate the stresses that only emerged under real conditions, could build in the redundancies that felt unnecessary until they suddenly weren't. The city's emergency logistics system had worked in January partly because of Keisha's insistence during the build phase on a backup protocol that Park's team had considered unnecessary. Evelyn had backed Keisha's insistence. It had been the right call. Dan had, in his 3rd year, begun training 2 junior client managers who had come in from outside, one fresh out of a business program, one a lateral hire from a larger firm. He had not asked Evelyn for permission to do this training. He had just begun doing it, and she had noticed it and said nothing, because what she noticed was that he was doing it exactly right, teaching them not the performance of the role, but the substance of it, the actual thinking required to understand what a client needed before the client had articulated it. One afternoon, she had stopped outside the small conference room where he was walking them through a client scenario and listened through the open door for a minute before continuing on. He was good at this. He had always been good at this. The call that changed the nature of what Nixora was came in May of the 3rd year from a woman named Dr. Sandra Obi, who was the Director of Disaster Response Logistics for a coalition of international development organizations based in Geneva. Sandra had read Rachel Torres's piece. She had then looked up Nixora's public project record. She had then called Howard Garland, the restitution administrator, who had given her a 15-minute description of what Evelyn Carter had built and how and why it worked. Then she had called. "We have a problem that I've been trying to solve for 3 years," Sandra said on the call. She spoke with the efficiency of someone who managed complex operations across multiple continents and had learned to communicate across time zones and language barriers. "We coordinate logistics for emergency response in developing regions. The challenge is not the money, and it's not the people. The challenge is that our systems don't talk to each other, and when you have 6 organizations responding to the same crisis, the last thing you have time to do is reconcile 6 different logistics platforms in real time." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. She was thinking about it architecturally, the way she always thought about a problem when someone described it. Not the surface of it, but the structure underneath. "What's the current workaround?" she asked. "Human intermediaries," Sandra said. "People who sit between the systems and translate manually, in real time." It works because we have extraordinary people, but it's fragile. If those people aren't available, which in a major disaster they sometimes aren't, the coordination fails. You need a translation layer, Evelyn said, not a unified system. A layer that sits above each organization's existing platform and facilitates communication without requiring anyone to change what they're already using. A pause on the line. That's exactly what I need, Sandra said. How long have you been thinking about this problem? About 90 seconds, Evelyn said, but I've been building toward it for a while. She sat with the project for 3 weeks before she committed. She talked to Keisha, who worked through the technical architecture and concluded it was possible but complicated. Possibly the most technically demanding thing they had attempted. She talked to Sylvia, who built a resource projection that was honest about the strain it would put on the company's capacity at its current size. She talked to Dan, who said, with characteristic directness, "This is the thing, isn't it? This is the version of the work that you actually want to do." She didn't answer right away. "It's the version that matters," she said eventually. "Same thing," Dan said. It wasn't quite the same thing, but she understood what he meant. She called Sandra Obi and said yes. The Geneva project took 18 months and cost the company more than money. There were 4 months in the middle of it where Evelyn worked longer hours than she had worked in her entire career at Blackwell Capital, and she was honest with herself about the fact that this was a choice, that she was choosing to build something that mattered over a version of her life that was easier. She didn't glamorize the choice. Some nights she drove home from the office at 9 o'clock feeling like she'd been taken apart and reassembled incorrectly, and she'd sit in her apartment and eat whatever was in the refrigerator and go to bed without doing the things she'd told herself she was going to do that evening. But she also knew on those nights what she was working toward. She had spent 15 years working hard without being able to fully answer that question. She could answer it now. The translation layer system, which Sandra's coalition called in their organizational materials the Nixora Bridge, went into pilot testing in month 17 and full deployment in month 18. The first real-world activation happened during a flooding emergency in a region of West Africa where 3 of Sandra's coalition organizations were simultaneously responding. Sandra sent an update the evening of day 2 of the response. The system coordinated supply routing across 3 platforms in real time. No manual intermediaries required. We redirected 2 supply convoys based on system-generated recommendations, and both reached target areas before window closed. This is working. Evelyn read the update in her office. It was late. Everyone else had gone home. The building was quiet in the way it got after 7, that specific after-hours silence of a working space that had genuinely worked that day. She thought about something she had not let herself think about in a long time, the morning she had driven to the building on South Walker for the last time. Space 47 in the parking garage, the ceramic mug on the passenger seat, the folder open to a merger timeline she would never finish. She had driven away from that building not knowing what came next, with the specific unmoored quality of having made an irreversible decision and being fully inside the space between what was and what might be. She had not known that morning that she would build this. She had known that morning that she would build something, that the work she knew how to do. The building of systems that served the people downstream of them, that told the truth, that held up under real conditions, that work was hers regardless of whose building she did it in. She had known that, and it had been enough to drive out of the garage and make the call and hand over the folder and begin. The rest of it had come from the doing. She looked at the blue ceramic mug on the corner of her desk, the uneven handle, the glaze that had dripped on one side. 3 years of coffee and work and difficult conversations and late nights and small victories and 1 or 2 significant ones. She was 58 years old. She had built 3 companies worth of understanding in 15 years working for someone else, and she was 3 years into building something that was entirely her own. She had colleagues she trusted and work that mattered, and a 6th floor they were starting to negotiate, and somewhere in a federal facility outside Chicago, a man who had laughed at her exit was serving a sentence that was not her victory, but was, at least, the right outcome of a just process. She did not feel triumphant about Victor. She had told Rachel Torres the truth about that. What she felt was closer to sad than satisfied, and not for herself. She felt sad for the waste of it, for the years of genuinely good work inside a structure that was quietly rotting, for the employees who had deserved better, for the version of a company that could have been if the person at the top had been a different kind of person. That was the thing about power that people misunderstood, she thought. Not for the first time, but with more certainty now than ever before. The conversation about power usually focused on what it could acquire, what it could protect, what it could crush. Victor had understood power entirely in those terms. He had acquired, he had protected, and he had tried to crush. And in the end, the crushing impulse had been the thing that finished him. He had looked at someone building the foundation his company stood on and decided to treat her as small, and the smallness had been entirely his. Real power, the durable kind, the kind that actually moved things in the world, came from being someone people genuinely trusted, not feared, not depended on through lack of options. Trusted. The kind of trust you built by doing what you said you would do, by building things that worked when you weren't watching, by caring about the outcome more than the credit. She had built that, over 15 years at a company that would never fully acknowledge it, and the trust had transferred with her when she left. Her clients trusted her because she had demonstrated, specifically and repeatedly, that the systems she built told the truth and held up under real conditions. Her employees trusted her because she had structured the company so that their knowledge and judgment actually influenced decisions. Howard Garland had trusted her enough to recommend her. Dolores Bryant had trusted her enough to send her to Marcus Park. Sandra Obi had trusted her enough to hand her a problem she'd been trying to solve for 3 years. None of it had come from the title she'd held. All of it had come from the work itself. She thought about the people she had thought about throughout all of this. Ruth from document processing, Carl from facilities maintenance, the administrative assistants who had organized themselves to navigate the claims process. She had never met most of them. She had thought about them specifically and by name because it was easy, she had learned, to care about people as a category, and much harder, and much more important, to care about them as individuals. To think, Ruth, Carl, actual people with actual lives that had been disrupted by someone else's choices made in rooms they were never invited into. The restitution had gone out. The pension funds had been restored. She had received, through the restitution administrator's office, a document at the end of the distribution process that confirmed 100% of identified beneficiaries compensated. 100%. She had that document in a drawer in her desk. She didn't look at it often, but it was there. Margaret had asked her once, in the second year, whether she was happy. They were at the kitchen table again. She went back to Margaret's kitchen regularly, not from necessity, but from the understanding that some places held things that mattered. Evelyn had thought about the question honestly. I don't know if happy is the right word, she said. What's the right word? She considered it for a long time. Engaged, she said. I feel like I'm doing the actual work, not the performance of the work itself. Margaret had looked at her for a moment. That sounds like happy to me. Maybe, Evelyn said. Margaret leaned forward. You came out of something that would have broken most people. You came out building. That's not nothing. It's not everything either, Evelyn said. No, Margaret agreed, but it's not nothing. They sat with that at the oak table that was older than either of them, in the kitchen that smelled like the candles from the Wicker Park shop, with the sounds of Lincoln Park coming through the window, the particular sounds of a city neighborhood in the evening, so ordinary and continuous and alive. Evelyn had turned 58 in March. She had taken the day off work, which was not something she did easily or often, and she had spent it doing things that had nothing to do with systems architecture or client relationships or project timelines. She had gone to the Art Institute and walked through it slowly, the way you could only do on a weekday when it wasn't crowded, and she had stood in front of paintings she'd walked past quickly 100 times and actually looked at them. She had called her niece from the museum steps in the cold March air and listened to a 20-minute update on the geology semester that had turned out to be going well after all. She had had dinner with Margaret and 2 friends she'd known for decades at a restaurant that was not impressive but was good, and they had talked for 4 hours about nothing important, and she had laughed more than she had laughed in a while. She had driven home through the city at 10 o'clock, through the neighborhood she'd known her whole life, and she had thought, this is a life I built, not the version I planned, not the version I thought I was building for most of my career, but real and mine, and built with materials that turned out to be more durable than the ones I was working with before. Now, in the quiet of her third-floor office with the Geneva message on her screen and the city dark outside, She picked up her notebook and wrote a few things about what needed to happen with the next phase of the bridge project. She wrote a note to herself about a conversation she needed to have with Keisha about the Indianapolis contract. She wrote a reminder about a call with Dolores Bryant the following week. Then she closed the notebook. She put on her coat. She turned off her lamp. The building went quiet behind her as she took the elevator down and walked out through the lobby into the May night. The air was warm, genuinely warm now, not the uncertain warmth of early spring, but the real thing, the warmth that said Chicago had finally committed to the season. She walked the 2 blocks to where she'd parked and stood for a moment by her car, not getting in yet, just standing in the evening. Somewhere in a federal facility outside Chicago, a man who had once stood at the head of a long mahogany table and said you're done was 3 years into a 22-year sentence, older than he'd expected to be in a situation like this, in a life he had not planned for himself. She didn't think about him often. When she did, it was not with the satisfaction she'd once imagined she might feel. It was with the quieter understanding that justice was not the same thing as closure, and that closure was not something anyone handed you from outside. You built it the same way you built everything else, piece by piece, from the inside out, with materials that were honest about what they were. She had built it. She was still building it. She got in the car. She drove home through the lit streets of Chicago, the city moving around her the way it always moved, enormous and indifferent and full of people living their lives inside the consequences of other people's decisions, trying their best, making do, occasionally building something that lasted. She was one of those people. She had always been one of those people. The difference now was that the building she was doing was her own. That, she thought, was enough. Not perfect, not finished, but enough and real, and worth every single thing it had cost her to get here.